The Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1917. The Armenian Genocide remains one of the most brutal yet silenced tragedies of the 20th century, where an entire population was marked for erasure under the shadows of war. Between 1915 and 1917, the Ottoman Empire orchestrated the mass deportation, starvation, and slaughter of over 1 million Armenians. Families were forced from their homes, driven into endless death marches across deserts without food or water, while countless others were executed or burned alive. What makes this lesson so haunting is not only the scale of the horror, but the deliberate attempt to erase every trace of its existence. Survivors were left with scars too deep for words, children torn from mothers, villages reduced to ash, and entire generations obliterated simply for existing. The psychological torment was just as devastating. Neighbors who once shared bread suddenly turned into executioners under government orders. Trust collapsed overnight, and people realized how quickly humanity could dissolve when hate is weaponized. Even worse, the world stood by. Global powers knew, yet silence reigned, allowing the perpetrators to hide behind denial. That silence carried forward, as even today, denial lingers, twisting memory into doubt, wounding descendants who fight not just for recognition, but for the dignity of truth. The Armenian Genocide teaches us how fragile human bonds become when propaganda poisons society, and how quickly compassion can be replaced with cruelty when survival is pitted against conscience. It shows the world's willingness to forget atrocities when they are politically inconvenient, and it reminds us that erasure can wound just as deeply as violence itself. The echoes of those death marches still linger, whispering a warning. When truth is silenced, history repeats. The Partition of India, 1947. The Partition of India in 1947 was not just a political separation of land, it was the tearing apart of hearts, homes, and centuries of shared existence. When British colonial rule ended, the decision to divide India into two nations, India and Pakistan, ignited one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Nearly 15 million people were uprooted, pushed across hastily drawn borders with nothing but what they could carry, while fear and confusion consumed entire communities overnight. Trains meant to carry families to safety often arrived at their destinations filled only with corpses. Villages that once celebrated festivals together became battlefields of vengeance, where neighbor turned against neighbor in a frenzy of bloodshed. The violence was staggering. Men were butchered in the streets, women endured unspeakable assaults, and children were left abandoned in the chaos. Families who had lived side by side for generations suddenly saw religion as a line that determined whether one would live or die. The tragedy was not only in the millions who perished, but in the way trust itself was massacred, leaving scars that continue to bleed into the politics and tensions of South Asia today. The partition teaches a dark truth about how fragile peace can be when leaders choose expedience over humanity. It shows how quickly propaganda and fear can shred the fabric of unity, turning ordinary people into executioners of those they once called friends. The cries of mothers searching for lost children, the silence of fathers slaughtered before their families, and the rivers running red with blood still haunt memory. It was not just borders that were drawn in 1947, it was wounds carved so deep into the soul of a people that they echo across generations, a reminder of what happens when humanity is sacrificed for power. The Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest stains on human history, where profit and power were built on the chains of human suffering. For over 4 centuries, millions of African men, women, and children were torn from their homelands, ripped from their families, and forced onto ships bound for the Americas and Europe. The journey itself, known as the Middle Passage, was a floating hell, bodies packed tightly into the dark, suffocating holds of ships, chained together in filth, disease spreading like wildfire, and death claiming countless lives before land was ever reached. The screams, the stench, and the silence of those who never survived still linger in the shadows of history. For those who lived, survival offered no mercy. They were sold like cattle, stripped of their names, languages, and identities, forced into brutal labor on plantations, where whips replaced compassion and cruelty became law. Families were destroyed at auction blocks, children stolen from their mothers' arms, while the enslavers justified their savagery with lies of superiority and civilization. Entire cultures were deliberately broken, yet in the midst of unimaginable suffering, enslaved people resisted through songs, stories, and secret rebellions, keeping alive the fragments of their humanity. The true horror lies not only in the physical torment, but in the deliberate dehumanization, the way generations of people were reduced to property, denied even the recognition of their pain. The Atlantic slave trade was not just about chains, it was about crushing spirits and rewriting humanity to serve greed. Its legacy endures in the inequalities and wounds still present today, a reminder of how cruelty, disguised as progress, can leave scars that centuries cannot heal. It is a lesson carved in blood and silence, showing how quickly humanity can be sold when profit becomes God. The Trail of Tears, 1830s. The Trail of Tears was not a migration. It was a death march forced upon entire nations, a deliberate act of cruelty disguised as progress. In the 1830s, under the Indian Removal Act, thousands of Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were violently uprooted from their ancestral homelands to make way for white settlers. Promised treaties and land rights were shredded by greed, and soldiers arrived to drag families from their homes at gunpoint, giving them no time to gather belongings, no mercy for the sick or the elderly. The journey westward became a graveyard without walls. Men, women, and children were forced to walk hundreds of miles through brutal winters, plagued by hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Along the frozen paths, mothers clutched lifeless infants, elders collapsed and were left behind, and families buried loved ones in shallow, unmarked graves before soldiers demanded they keep moving. Nearly a quarter of the Cherokee Papu'i population alone perished during this forced removal, and their cries were swallowed by the indifference of a government that valued land more than lives. The Trail of Tears is a lesson in betrayal, showing how promises written in ink meant nothing when power and greed dictated the future. It reveals the cold reality of how entire peoples can be erased, not only from their land, but from the memory of a nation that prefers to bury its guilt. The soil of America is heavy with the footsteps of the displaced and the dead, echoing a truth too painful to ignore. Progress, when built on injustice, is nothing more than a legacy of sorrow. The Opium Wars from 1839 to 1860. The Opium Wars were not battles for freedom or progress. They were wars of greed, where an empire was poisoned to feed another's hunger for wealth. In the mid-19th century, Britain forced open the doors of China with the most devastating weapon of all, addiction. When China resisted the flood of opium being smuggled into its ports, an epidemic already crippling families and hollowing out society, Britain unleashed its naval might to defend, not honor, but profit. Gunboats rained fire on Chinese cities, and soldiers trampled resistance, all to secure the right to keep poisoning millions for commercial gain. Behind the battlefield lay devastation that words can scarcely hold. Families sold their possessions to feed an addiction forced upon them. Children starved as parents collapsed in stupors, and communities crumbled as entire generations were chained not by iron, but by powder. What makes the lesson so harrowing is that the suffering was never incidental. It was intentional. A great empire saw another not as a sovereign nation, but as a marketplace to exploit. Humanity reduced to profit margins. The humiliation of China went beyond addiction. The Treaty of Nanking, signed under duress, handed over Hong Kong and opened Chinese ports to foreign control, birthing a century of humiliation that scarred the nation's pride and identity. The Opium Wars stand as a brutal reminder of how power cloaked in commerce can destroy the spirit of a people, and how imperialism wages war not only on bodies but on dignity. The echoes of those poisoned years still linger, whispering of the cruelty unleashed when profit is placed above humanity. The Holodomor Famine in Ukraine, 1932 to 1933. The Holodomor was not a natural famine, but a calculated weapon, a silent war waged against a people by their own rulers. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians starved to death under the crushing policies of Joseph Stalin's regime. Grain was seized from villages at gunpoint, leaving shelves bare and families with nothing but despair. Armed guards prevented peasants from keeping even a handful of their harvests, while borders were sealed to trap them within their dying lands. In the richest soil of Europe, fields lay full, yet the people who tilled them wasted away. The suffering was unimaginable. Mothers fed grass and bark to their children in desperate attempts to keep them alive. Starvation distorted faces, thinned bodies into shadows, and drove some into unspeakable acts of survival. Entire villages vanished, reduced to silence as death became the only constant companion. The cruelty was sharpened by indifference. Grain exports continued abroad, while inside Ukraine, families collapsed in doorways and streets filled with corpses that no one had the strength to bury. The Holodomor's darkness lies not only in the famine itself, but in the deliberate erasure of its truth. For decades, it was cloaked in denial, its victims silenced beneath propaganda that twisted hunger into a myth of laziness and disloyalty. Generations grew up with gaps in their history, carrying wounds that had no names. This lesson shows how tyranny can murder without bullets, how power can use silence as its deadliest weapon, and how indifference from the world can turn suffering into annihilation. The Holodomor was not just famine, it was genocide by hunger, a scar carved into the very soul of Ukraine. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932-1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment is one of the most chilling examples of betrayal disguised as science, where trust was weaponized against the very people who placed their faith in authority. Beginning in 1932, hundreds of poor African American men in Tuskegee, Alabama, were recruited under the promise of free medical care. What they were not told was that doctors had no intention of curing them. These men, many already infected with syphilis, were deliberately left untreated, so researchers could watch the disease slowly ravage their bodies. Even when penicillin became a widely recognized cure in the 1940s, the men were still denied treatment. Instead, they were fed lies, given placebos, and subjected to endless tests while the illness consumed them. Fathers died, wives contracted the disease, and children were born with congenital syphilis, all while the government calmly recorded their suffering in the name of research. The men were not patients. They were experiments, stripped of dignity, used as tools to satisfy scientific curiosity, and discarded when broken. The most haunting part is not only the cruelty, but the silence that surrounded it. For 40 years, the truth remained hidden, while entire families carried the burden of betrayal. This atrocity carved into history a scar of mistrust, leaving generations of African Americans with deep skepticism toward medical institutions. The Tuskegee experiment reveals how easily power can dehumanize when ethics are abandoned, how racism can dress itself in the language of progress, and how lives can be destroyed under the pretense of knowledge. It is a dark lesson in how trust, once shattered, becomes a wound that never fully heals. The Cultural Revolution in China, 1966 to 1976. The Cultural Revolution was not just a political campaign. It was a decade-long storm that tore through China, leaving behind shattered families, silenced voices, and a nation scarred by fear. Launched by Mao Zedong in 1966, it was presented as a movement to purge bourgeois elements and preserve revolutionary purity, but it quickly descended into chaos. Students became Red Guards, children turned on their teachers, neighbors accused each other of treason, and centuries of culture were reduced to ash. Ancient temples were desecrated, priceless artifacts destroyed, and intellectuals dragged into public squares where humiliation, beatings, and executions became daily spectacles. What makes this period especially haunting is the way it turned love into betrayal. Sons denounced fathers, wives abandoned husbands, friends became enemies, all to prove loyalty to the party. Families fractured under the crushing weight of suspicion, and silence became the only defense against the terror of being labeled an enemy. Millions were sent to labor camps where starvation and brutality replaced dignity, while others took their own lives rather than endure endless persecution. The Cultural Revolution teaches the terrifying power of ideology when wielded as a weapon. It shows how easily truth can be rewritten, how fragile trust becomes when propaganda dictates loyalty, and how quickly fear can transform ordinary people into executioners of their own. The emotional scars remain buried deep in those who survived, many still too afraid to speak. Behind the slogans of revolution lay the cries of countless voices erased, and the lesson that when thought itself is controlled, humanity is shattered. The Rwandan Genocide, 1994. The Rwandan Genocide in 1994 was not war. It was annihilation carried out with terrifying speed and intimacy. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered, not by distant armies, but by neighbors, friends, and even family members turned executioners. The weapons were not machines of war, but machetes, clubs, and fire, wielded with a ferocity born from years of propaganda that painted human beings as cockroaches to be exterminated. Streets, churches, and schools became killing grounds, and the air was thick with screams and silence, where entire families vanished in a single night. What makes the lesson so haunting is how deliberately it was engineered. Radio stations broadcast calls for murder, officials handed out lists of names, and the very institutions meant to protect citizens became instruments of slaughter. Women were not only killed, but systematically raped, leaving scars that stretched beyond death, while children were hunted as if their existence itself was a threat. The horror unfolded in full view of the world, yet the international community stood paralyzed, watching rivers fill with bodies and doing almost nothing to stop it. The Rwandan Genocide exposes the terrifying fragility of humanity when hatred is nurtured and dehumanization becomes law. It shows how neighbors can transform into killers when fear and propaganda strip away empathy, and how silence from the world can be as deadly as the blades that cut through the innocent. The lesson it leaves is searing. When hate is left unchecked, civilization can collapse in days, leaving only ashes, echoes, and graves where communities once stood. The Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. The Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia was a nightmare brought to life, a 4-year reign of terror where the idea of a perfect society became an excuse for mass slaughter. Led by Pol Pot, the regime sought to erase modernity and rebuild Cambodia into an agrarian utopia, but in their obsession with purity, they reduced their nation to a graveyard. Cities were emptied at gunpoint, families were forced into the countryside, and millions were enslaved in backbreaking labor under the blistering sun with barely enough food to survive. Hospitals, schools, and markets were shut down, as even the faintest hint of individuality or education was deemed an enemy of the state. What followed was one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century. Intellectuals, teachers, doctors, monks, and anyone who wore glasses or spoke a foreign language were executed. Children were separated from their parents and brainwashed, turning them into tools of the regime. The notorious killing fields became the final destination for countless souls, where bodies were piled in mass graves and silence swallowed the screams of the condemned. Torture prisons, like Tuol Sleng, turned confession into a death sentence, with victims brutalized before being discarded like refuse. The Khmer Rouge's cruelty was sharpened by its betrayal. People who once dreamed of independence and freedom instead found themselves living under constant fear, where even a whisper could mean death. Between 1.7 and 2 million Cambodians perished, not just from executions but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. This dark lesson reveals how ideology, when twisted into fanaticism, can strip away every trace of humanity, turning neighbor against neighbor and a country into a wasteland of bones. It stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly hope can be transformed into horror when power is unchecked. Japanese Unit 731 Experiments, Wawuwutu. The story of Unit 731 is a descent into the most grotesque depths of human cruelty, where science was twisted into an instrument of torture. During World War II, in occupied Manchuria, the Japanese Imperial Army established a covert research facility known as Unit 731. Behind its walls, doctors and scientists committed unspeakable acts upon living prisoners, Chinese civilians, Koreans, Russians, and even captured Allied soldiers. The victims were dehumanized, stripped of names, and referred to only as logs, as though they were nothing more than disposable objects. What unfolded inside remains one of the most horrifying chapters in history. People were vivisected alive without anesthesia, their organs studied as they screamed. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, and cholera to watch disease consume the body. Frostbite experiments left men's limbs frozen solid before being shattered with hammers, while women were raped and impregnated to study sexually transmitted infections passed to unborn children. Death was not an outcome, but a requirement, engineered to serve Japan's pursuit of biological warfare. Even more unsettling was the aftermath. When the war ended, many of those responsible were not punished, but shielded. In exchange for their research data, the United States granted immunity to the perpetrators, erasing accountability and burying the truth beneath the politics of the Cold War. Justice was denied, and the victims' screams were silenced beneath the weight of secrecy. Unit 731 is a lesson in how science without conscience becomes monstrous, how nationalism can strip away empathy, and how the pursuit of power can excuse even the most barbaric crimes. It is proof that the human capacity for cruelty knows no limits when morality is sacrificed for ambition. The Belgian atrocities in the Congo, 1885 to 1908. The Belgian atrocities in the Congo were not simply colonial exploitation. They were a reign of terror masked as civilization. Under the rule of King Leopold II from 1885 to 1908, the Congo Free State became a private empire built on the blood of its people. Villages were forced into brutal labor to harvest rubber, ivory, and other resources, all while soldiers enforced quotas with unspeakable cruelty. Those who failed to meet demands faced mutilation, hands severed, children murdered, women taken hostage to force compliance. Entire families were broken to fuel the greed of one man and the empire that praised his so-called philanthropy. The suffering was endless. Men chained together were marched deep into forests, whipped until their backs split open, left to starve while extracting wealth that would never be theirs. Mothers watched their children die of hunger as food was confiscated to supply Belgian markets. Villages were burned to the ground as punishment, leaving the land itself scarred alongside its people. It is estimated that as many as 10 million lives were lost during this period. and annihilation hidden behind the facade of progress and charity. What makes this lesson so dark is the silence that followed. For years, the world turned a blind eye, distracted by the image of Leopold as a benevolent king. The screams of the Congo were muffled beneath the lies of civilization and Christian duty. The atrocities reveal how easily cruelty can be disguised as benevolence, and how the hunger for wealth can erase the value of human life. The Congo's blood-soaked soil still whispers a warning. When greed wears the mask of morality, humanity itself is in peril. The Bombing of Dresden, 1945. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 was not a battle won, but a city burned alive. In the final months of World War II, Allied forces unleashed a storm of fire upon a city already swollen with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. Over the course of 3 nights, wave after wave of bombers rained down explosives and incendiaries, transforming Dresden, a cultural jewel known for its art, architecture, and history, into a furnace. The firestorm grew so fierce that it sucked the very air from the lungs of those hiding underground, suffocating families before flames consumed their bodies. Streets melted, buildings collapsed, and tens of thousands were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The tragedy of Dresden was not in its military significance. It had little. It was in the deliberate destruction of a city filled with civilians, women, children, and the elderly, trapped in a hell they could not escape. Survivors stumbled through a wasteland of charred bodies and twisted ruins, carrying memories that seared deeper than the burns on their skin. The horror was amplified by the realization that this was not simply war, it was vengeance, the desire to break a nation's spirit through fire. Dresden stands as a haunting reminder that victory does not erase atrocity. It reveals the terrible cost of war when morality collapses and human lives become bargaining chips in a strategy of terror. The ruins of that once beautiful city cry out across history, showing how even the victors of war can stain their hands with actions that burn not just cities, but conscience itself. The Firebombing of Tokyo, 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 was not just another military strike. It was a deliberate inferno unleashed on a city filled with civilians, turning a capital into a sea of flames. In a single night, American B-29 bombers dropped hundreds of thousands of incendiary bombs across Tokyo, igniting one of the most devastating air raids in human history. The wooden homes and narrow streets became kindling, fueling a firestorm so intense that it sucked the oxygen from the air, leaving people gasping as heat waves seared their lungs. Families fled into the night only to be swallowed by walls of fire that moved faster than they could run. The horror was unimaginable. Parents clutched their children as fire consumed them. Rivers boiled with bodies of those who sought refuge in the water, and entire neighborhoods vanished in hours. Nearly 100,000 people were killed in that single raid, more than by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, yet their suffering has been overshadowed and often forgotten. Survivors carried scars, not only on their skin, but in their memories, haunted by the screams of loved ones and the silence of those who never made it out. What makes this tragedy so dark is not only the scale of death, but the deliberate targeting of civilians, reducing them to statistics in a strategy of total war. It was a night where the line between soldier and innocent collapsed into ash, where war justified the annihilation of the defenseless. The firebombing of Tokyo stands as a chilling reminder of how modern warfare can turn entire cities into graves, teaching us that victory built on burning humanity leaves nothing but embers of sorrow. The Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 1961. The Great Chinese Famine was not just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe born from pride, politics, and denial. Between 1959 and 1961, Under Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, China sought to transform itself into a modern, industrial power. Fields were abandoned for steel furnaces, false reports of record harvests were sent up the chain of command, and local officials, terrified of questioning the regime, allowed lies to become law. Grain was seized by the state even as villages starved, and the people were left to wither in silence. The result was the death of tens of millions. Families boiled bark and weeds into thin soups. Mothers smothered their cries as children wasted away in their arms, and entire villages emptied into shallow graves. Starvation warped morality itself. Neighbors turned against one another, and whispers of cannibalism became desperate acts of survival. Yet amid this horror, the government suppressed the truth, branding those who spoke of hunger as traitors and punishing any attempt to expose the reality. What makes this famine so haunting is that it was preventable. It was not the earth that betrayed its people, but the arrogance of leadership, the crushing weight of propaganda, and the silence imposed by fear. The Great Chinese Famine reveals how ideology, when elevated above humanity, can murder on a scale that defies comprehension. It shows how truth can be buried beneath political ambition, leaving millions to die unheard, uncounted, and unacknowledged. The land of plenty became a land of death, and the echoes of those empty stomachs still remind us how denial can be as deadly as any weapon. The Boer War concentration camps, 1899 to 1902. The Boer War concentration camps were not accidents of war, but deliberate instruments of control, where thousands of innocent civilians, mostly women and children, were left to waste away in misery. During the Second Boer War between the British Empire and Boer settlers in South Africa, scorched earth tactics destroyed farms, livestock, and homes, leaving families with nowhere to go. To break the resistance, the British herded Boer civilians into camps meant to contain them, but what unfolded inside those barbed wire enclosures was a slow-motion catastrophe. The conditions were inhumane. Tents offered little protection from the scorching heat or the bitter cold. Food rations were scarce, and clean water almost non-existent. Disease swept through the camps like wildfire, claiming the lives of children who starved with swollen bellies while their mothers watched helplessly. Medical care was grossly inadequate, and neglect turned curable sicknesses into death sentences. By the time the war ended, more than 26,000 Boer women and children had perished in these camps, along with thousands of black Africans forced into similar prisons, their suffering largely erased from official memory. What makes this lesson so chilling is the cold calculation behind it. These were not battlefields where soldiers clashed, but cages where innocents were left to die as part of a strategy. The image of an empire that prided itself on civilization was built on the corpses of its captives, hidden beneath reports that softened the truth. The Boer war camps reveal how power can normalize cruelty when victory is placed above humanity, and how silence allows suffering to disappear into the shadows of history. The Bloody Sunday Massacre in Ireland, 1972. The Bloody Sunday Massacre of January 30th, 1972, was a day when peaceful protest was met with bullets, and trust in justice was drowned in blood. In Derry, Northern Ireland, unarmed civilians marched against internment, demanding dignity and freedom from oppression. They carried no weapons, only voices, but the British Army opened fire into the crowd, killing 14 people and wounding many more. Fathers, sons, teenagers, ordinary people who believed in their right to protest, were gunned down in broad daylight, their bodies collapsing on the same streets where they had walked in hope. The horror of Bloody Sunday was not just in the killing itself, but in the betrayal it represented. A state that claimed to uphold law and order unleashed its soldiers on its own citizens, then cloaked the truth in lies. Victims were smeared as aggressors, painted as threats to justify the slaughter, while grieving families were left to fight decades for recognition of their loved ones' innocence. For the people of Ireland, the massacre became a wound that deepened the conflict, fueling rage and despair in a society already fractured by division. The lesson of Bloody Sunday is a chilling one. When power fears dissent, it often responds not with dialogue, but with violence, silencing voices by spilling blood. It shows how quickly institutions meant to protect can turn into instruments of oppression, and how injustice denied festers into bitterness that lasts for generations. The echoes of gunfire in Derry still haunt memory, a reminder that the line between peace and massacre is often drawn by those who hold the trigger. The Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was not a riot, as it was long mislabeled. It was an organized campaign of destruction against a thriving black community. In the district of Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, African Americans had built a prosperous society of businesses, theaters, schools, and homes, a beacon of resilience and achievement in the face of segregation. But in just 2 days, envy and hatred turned that success into ash. White mobs, some armed and even supported by local authorities, stormed Greenwood, looting shops, burning houses, and gunning down residents in the streets. Airplanes dropped incendiaries from above, making the sky itself complicit in the devastation. What unfolded was nothing short of racial terror. Families who had worked for generations lost everything in hours, businesses reduced to rubble, wealth stolen, and bodies left in the streets or dumped in unmarked graves. Survivors spoke of hiding in ditches as flames swallowed the city, of mothers clutching children as mobs broke down doors, of fathers shot while defending their homes. The death toll remains uncertain, but hundreds were likely killed and thousands left homeless, their dreams erased in fire and blood. The deepest wound came not only from the massacre itself, but from the silence that followed. For decades, history books ignored it, officials buried records, and survivors were silenced by fear, leaving generations unaware of the horror that had unfolded on American soil. The Tulsa Race Massacre is a lesson in how hatred, when fueled by envy and sanctioned by power, can erase entire communities, and how erasure itself becomes another form of violence. The ashes of Greenwood still speak, a reminder of what happens when prosperity and skin color are seen as crimes worthy of annihilation. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. The Sand Creek Massacre is a story of betrayal so brutal that its echoes still haunt the soul of America. On a cold November morning in 1864, hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, many of them women, children, and the elderly, were camped along Sand Creek in Colorado under the promise of safety. They had raised a white flag of surrender, a desperate plea for peace, believing they were under the protection of the U.S. Army. Instead, Colonel John Chivington and his soldiers descended upon them with unimaginable violence. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Over 200 Native Americans were killed, their bodies mutilated in ways too horrific to comprehend. Women were raped before being murdered. Infants were shot at point-blank range, and scalps and body parts were paraded through the streets of Denver as trophies. The massacre was carried out with such savagery that even some soldiers who participated spoke out in horror at what they had done. Yet the government attempted to bury the truth beneath patriotic lies. The Sand Creek Massacre is a lesson in the darkest extremes of dehumanization, when hatred and greed strip away all recognition of another people's humanity. It shows how promises of peace can be twisted into traps, and how entire communities can be annihilated simply for standing in the way of expansion and conquest. The land at Sand Creek is soaked with blood, and its silence still whispers of betrayal, cruelty, and the fragile cost of trusting in the word of those who hold power. It is a wound in history that refuses to close, reminding us that progress built on massacre is nothing but theft written in flesh. The My Lai Massacre in Vietnam, 1968. The My Lai Massacre was not a battle. It was the cold slaughter of the defenseless, a moment when humanity collapsed under the weight of war. On March 16, 1968, during the Vietnam War, U.S. soldiers entered the village of My Lai, supposedly searching for enemy fighters. What followed was not combat, but carnage. In a span of hours, more than 500 unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and even infants, were gunned down in their own homes and fields. Women were brutalized before being killed, elders begging for mercy were executed, and families were wiped out in front of one another. The village itself became a graveyard soaked in blood. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is the deliberate attempt to bury it. Reports were falsified. The massacre was described as a victory, and for over a year, the truth was hidden from the world. It was only when brave whistleblowers stepped forward that the horrors of My Lai were exposed, igniting outrage and forcing people to confront the cruelty committed in the name of war. Yet accountability was shallow. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted, and even he served little time, a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be denied. The My Lai Massacre teaches a devastating lesson about the dehumanizing nature of war. When soldiers are taught to see civilians as the enemy, compassion dies and atrocity becomes possible. It reveals how propaganda can twist murder into patriotism and how silence, if unbroken, can bury even the most horrific truths. My Lai stands as a scar on history, a reminder that the greatest danger in war is not just the enemy, but the darkness it awakens within ourselves. The Indian residential schools in Canada. The Indian residential schools in Canada were not schools at all. They were instruments of cultural erasure, designed to break the spirit of indigenous peoples under the mask of education. For over a century, from the late 1800s to the 1990s, indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and communities, placed in distant government and church-run institutions where their language, traditions, and very identities were beaten out of them. Their hair was cut, their clothes replaced, and their native tongues forbidden, replaced with punishments and sermons that told them their heritage was shameful. Childhood laughter was replaced with silence, fear, and despair. Behind those walls lay horrors that scarred generations. Children were starved, beaten, sexually abused, and forced into relentless labor. Many never came home. Graves continue to be uncovered at former school sites. The small bodies of children who died alone, nameless and forgotten by the institutions that claimed to civilize them. Parents were left to wonder what had become of their sons and daughters, their grief compounded by silence and denial from the very government that stole them. Survivors who lived carried the weight of trauma into adulthood, scars that fractured families and communities for decades. The residential school system was more than cruelty. It was an attempt to erase an entire people by severing the bond between parent and child, language and land, culture and identity. It is a lesson carved into the soil of Canada, a reminder that genocide is not always swift or loud. Sometimes it is slow, systematic, and disguised as progress, leaving wounds that echo through bloodlines long after the last bell has rung. The stolen generations in Australia. The stolen generations in Australia represent one of the most devastating assaults on identity and family, where government policies tore Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their parents under the guise of protection. From the late 1800s to the 1970s, countless indigenous children were forcibly removed, often snatched from their mothers' arms by authorities, missionaries, or police, and sent to institutions or foster homes with the intent of erasing their culture. They were forbidden to speak their native languages, stripped of their traditions, and indoctrinated to abandon the very heritage that defined them. Behind these policies lay a chilling belief that indigenous people could be bred out through assimilation, that their culture was something to be destroyed rather than preserved. The result was not just the breaking of families, but the severing of an ancient continuity that stretched back tens of thousands of years. Children grew up in environments of neglect and abuse, starved of love and connection, left to believe their families had abandoned them. Parents were left in anguish, powerless to protect their children, carrying grief that never healed. The scars ripple through generations. Survivors of the stolen generations carry deep trauma, an identity fractured, a history stolen, and a trust in society permanently shattered. Many turned into adults, still searching for the families they lost, haunted by memories of loneliness and pain. This dark lesson exposes how systemic cruelty can disguise itself as benevolence, how institutions can justify cultural genocide in the language of care. It is a reminder that taking a child's future by stealing their past is one of the most ruthless acts of erasure, leaving wounds that echo through time. The Great Purge under Stalin, 1936 to 1938. The Great Purge under Joseph Stalin was a reign of terror where fear became the air people breathed, and silence was the only means of survival. Between 1936 and 1938, the Soviet Union was consumed by a wave of arrests, executions, and imprisonments orchestrated by its own leader. Stalin, obsessed with absolute control, saw enemies everywhere, within the Communist Party, the military, and among ordinary citizens. Loyalty was meaningless. Even the most devoted comrades could be branded as traitors overnight. Millions were seized in the dead of night, dragged from their homes by secret police, and vanished into the labyrinth of gulags or firing squads. Trials were nothing more than theater, confessions beaten out through torture, and verdicts decided before a word was spoken. Families were torn apart, with children left to starve as parents disappeared into prison camps. Neighbors learned to fear one another, for a whispered accusation, true or false, was enough to destroy a life. The purge infected the very soul of society. Trust collapsed as husbands doubted wives, friends betrayed each other, and children were encouraged to denounce their parents. Terror became so routine that people forgot what safety felt like, living each day wondering if it would be their last. The Great Purge reveals the horrifying power of paranoia when it takes root in leadership. It shows how a ruler's insecurity can bleed into a nation, weaponizing fear until no one is innocent, no one is safe. The silence of the mass graves and the empty spaces left at family tables tell the story of a nation devouring itself, a chilling reminder of how absolute power thrives on absolute terror. The Katyn Massacre, 1940. The Katyn Massacre was not simply a war crime. It was an act of calculated erasure meant to silence a nation by striking at its very heart. In the spring of 1940, deep within the forests of Katyn and other secret sites, over 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, priests, and leaders were systematically executed by the Soviet NKVD under Stalin's orders. They were the backbone of Poland's cultural and political life, men taken as prisoners of war and promised safety, only to be bound, blindfolded, and shot in the back of the head before being dumped into mass graves. It was not just the slaughter of individuals, but the deliberate decapitation of a people's future. What makes Katyn especially chilling is not only the brutality, but the silence that followed. For decades, the Soviet Union denied responsibility, blaming Nazi Germany, while any Polish voices demanding truth were silenced through intimidation or death. Families of the victims lived in limbo, unable to grieve properly, their loved ones reduced to whispers and rumors. Generations grew up knowing their fathers and grandfathers had been taken, but forbidden from speaking the truth, forced to carry grief like a hidden wound. The Katyn Massacre teaches the darkest lesson about power and denial, that killing the body is not enough if the truth can also be buried. It reveals how easily memory can be manipulated, how facts can be twisted into lies, and how silence can wound deeper than bullets. Katyn was not only a forest of death, it was a forest of silenced voices, a haunting reminder of how truth itself becomes a casualty of war. The Trail of Tears in the U.S. The Trail of Tears in the United States was not a relocation. It was a forced death march that tore entire nations from their homes in the name of greed. In the 1830s, the U.S. government passed the Indian Removal Act, seizing the lands of the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole peoples to make way for white settlers. Promises of protection and treaties signed in ink meant nothing once gold was discovered, and expansion demanded blood. Soldiers stormed villages, driving families from their homes with only the clothes on their backs, forcing them to walk thousands of miles toward lands they had never seen. The march westward became a living nightmare. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, disease swept through camps, and exposure to freezing winters claimed thousands of lives. Children collapsed in their mothers' arms, the elderly fell along the path and were left unburied, and families were shattered by the relentless pace of soldiers who showed no mercy. Nearly 16,000 Cherokee were driven from their homes, and thousands never survived the journey. The Trail of Tears reveals the betrayal at the heart of American expansion, a government willing to sacrifice entire peoples for land, wealth, and power, cloaking brutality under the word progress. It shows how human lives were reduced to obstacles, erased with cold efficiency, while the soil of a nation was watered with the suffering of those who once called it home. The Trail of Tears is more than a chapter in history. It is a scar across the land itself, where the footsteps of the dying still echo, warning of the cost when ambition tramples humanity. The Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was not simply a religious tribunal. It was an empire of fear, where faith was twisted into a weapon and suspicion became a death sentence. Established in 1478, it claimed to defend Catholic purity, but in reality, it was a machine of control designed to crush dissent and silence anyone who threatened the authority of church or crown. Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and even Christians accused of wavering were dragged before inquisitors, their lives unraveled by whispers, denunciations, and fabricated confessions. No one was safe, for even the faintest rumor could condemn a person to the dungeon. Torture chambers became theaters of agony, where screams echoed through stone walls as men and women were broken in body and spirit. Innocents confessed to crimes they never committed, simply to escape the unbearable torment, only to face execution in public spectacles meant to terrify the masses. Families lived in constant dread, unsure if a neighbor, a friend, or even a relative might betray them for survival or gain. Trust evaporated, and society turned inward, suffocated by paranoia and silence. The Inquisition was more than blood and fire. It was the systematic erasure of thought, the suffocation of curiosity, and the extinguishing of freedom. It left a legacy of terror that taught people to hide their true selves, to bury their beliefs deep inside, fearing punishment for even thinking differently. This dark lesson reveals how institutions, when granted unchecked power, can twist morality into cruelty and faith into oppression. The Spanish Inquisition was not just about punishing heresy, it was about ruling through fear, proving how quickly humanity can be sacrificed when ideology becomes law. The Salem Witch Trials, 1692. The Salem witch trials were a storm of hysteria where fear and superstition consumed reason, turning an entire community against itself. In 1692, the small Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, descended into chaos after a handful of young girls claimed to be afflicted by witchcraft. Their accusations spread like wildfire, igniting paranoia that transformed neighbors, friends, and even family members into potential enemies. The courts, blinded by religious fervor and public panic, treated rumors as evidence and dreams as proof of guilt. What followed was a cascade of accusations, fueled by vengeance, envy, and fear of the unknown. Over 200 people were accused, and 20 were executed, 19 by hanging and 1 crushed to death under heavy stones. Innocent lives were destroyed by the whispers of frightened children and the willingness of authority to embrace fear over truth. Farmers lost their land, families were ripped apart, and the air of Salem grew thick with mistrust as people realized anyone could be next. The tragedy lies not only in the deaths, but in the atmosphere of betrayal and hysteria that consumed an entire society. Friends turned on each other to save themselves, while the powerful used the chaos to settle scores. The Salem witch trials reveal how easily fear can corrode justice, how quickly mass panic can strip away compassion, and how fragile truth becomes when drowned out by the cries of suspicion. The echoes of Salem warn us that hysteria, once unleashed, does not need evidence to destroy lives. It only needs belief. The Irish Potato Famine, 1845 to 1852. The Irish Potato Famine was not merely a natural disaster. It was a human catastrophe magnified by neglect, indifference, and exploitation. Beginning in 1845, a blight swept through Ireland's potato crops, destroying the primary food source for millions of poor Irish families. What might have been a temporary agricultural crisis turned into a death sentence when the British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, refused to provide adequate relief. Ships laden with food continued to leave Irish ports bound for England, while the people who harvested it starved in their own land. Hunger hollowed the countryside. Families wandered barefoot through fields of rotting crops, searching for anything to eat. Parents watched helplessly as children wasted away, their bodies swollen with starvation. Disease followed in famine's footsteps. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery spreading through weakened populations, filling mass graves with the dead. Entire villages were abandoned, homes left empty, and the once lush land of Ireland became a landscape of silence and grief. The tragedy did not end with death alone. Millions were forced to flee, boarding coffin ships to America and beyond, where many perished on the journey, their bodies cast into the sea. Those who survived carried with them not only loss, but the bitterness of betrayal, for the famine revealed how colonial rule valued profit and control over human life. The Irish Potato Famine is a searing reminder that starvation is rarely just about food. It is about power, oppression, and the cruelty of indifference. It shows how easily lives can be discarded when entire people are seen as expendable, and how suffering can echo across generations when silence replaces justice. The Great Depression's hidden deaths and suicides. The Great Depression of the 1930s is often remembered through images of bread lines, dust storms, and stock market crashes, but behind those photographs lay a quieter, more haunting toll, deaths that were never counted and suicides whispered away in shame. When the financial system collapsed, millions lost their jobs, homes, and savings overnight. Fathers who once carried pride in providing for their families returned home empty-handed, broken by despair. Mothers skipped meals so their children might eat, only to collapse from exhaustion. Families huddled in shantytowns built from scraps, where hunger gnawed at bodies and hopelessness consumed the soul. But the tragedy most often hidden was the wave of suicides that followed. Bankers who had once held fortunes jumped from windows as their empires crumbled. But far more devastating were the countless ordinary men and women who ended their lives in silence, unable to bear the weight of poverty, shame, and fear of a future with no escape. Newspapers muted the stories, families buried the truth, and governments avoided tallying the human costs, preferring to speak of recovery rather than the graves that deepened every day. The lesson of the Great Depression is not just about economic collapse. It is about the fragility of the human spirit when hope is stripped away. It shows how despair can take more lives than hunger, how silence can bury truths deeper than soil, and how suffering that is hidden is often the most devastating of all. The photographs of the era show faces etched with hardship, but behind those eyes were stories that never made it into history books. Lives lost not to war or disaster, but to despair. The Nanjing Massacre, 1937 to 1938. The Nanjing Massacre was a descent into unimaginable cruelty, a 6-week reign of terror where an entire city was turned into a killing ground. When Japanese forces invaded Nanjing, the capital of China, in December 1937, they unleashed a brutality that defies comprehension. Over 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were slaughtered, not as casualties of battle, but as deliberate targets of rage and domination. Streets became rivers of blood, homes were invaded, and no sanctuary was spared from the storm of violence. The atrocities were carried out with a savagery meant to humiliate as much as to destroy. Thousands of women were subjected to mass rape, their bodies treated as spoils of war, often murdered afterward to erase the evidence of violation. Fathers were executed before their families, children were cut down without mercy, and entire households were wiped from existence. Soldiers competed in killing contests, turning murder into sport, while commanders allowed the madness to fester unchecked. The city itself became a graveyard, echoing with the cries of the defenseless and the silence of those whose voices were forever stolen. What makes the Nanjing Massacre so haunting is not just the scale of death, but the coldness of it, the way humanity was stripped away until cruelty became entertainment. For survivors, memory itself became a battlefield, haunted by the question of how neighbors in the human family could descend so deeply into barbarity. This dark lesson reminds us that war does not only destroy armies, it can unravel the very essence of compassion, leaving only horror in its place. The ashes of Nanjing stand as proof of how swiftly civilization can collapse into carnage when hatred and dehumanization are left unchecked. The forced sterilization programs. The forced sterilization programs of the 20th century are a chilling reminder of how cruelty can masquerade as progress when science and power unite without conscience. Across the United States, Europe, and beyond, governments sterilize hundreds of thousands of people without their knowledge or consent. They targeted the poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, minorities, and women deemed unfit to reproduce, branding them as burdens to society. Under the guise of eugenics, doctors cut into bodies and stole futures, leaving scars that were not only physical but generational. In the United States alone, entire communities were devastated by this hidden war on fertility. Native American women were sterilized in staggering numbers, many never told what had been done until they awoke from routine surgeries with their motherhood stolen. Black women in the South were subjected to the so-called Mississippi appendectomy, sterilized without consent while undergoing unrelated procedures. Young girls and boys were forced into operating rooms under orders of the state, labeled defective, and stripped of the most intimate human right, the right to create life. The horror was not only in the act, but in the justification. Eugenics was celebrated by politicians, scientists, and even Supreme Court rulings, which coldly declared 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This cold logic turned people into statistics, lives into experiments, and dreams into ashes. The forced sterilization programs reveal how prejudice, once given scientific language, can destroy lives with the stroke of a scalpel. It is a lesson in how power can disguise oppression as health, and how entire generations can be silenced before they ever have the chance to exist. The silence of those unborn children is the most haunting reminder of all. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba, 1961. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba was not just the silencing of a man, it was the deliberate murder of hope for an entire nation. Lumumba, the first prime minister of an independent Congo, rose as a powerful voice against colonial exploitation, demanding dignity, unity, and control of Congo's immense natural wealth for its own people. His words electrified crowds, frightening Western powers and their allies who saw in him not freedom but a threat to their dominance. Within months of independence in 1960, chaos was fueled by foreign interference, secessionist movements, and a campaign to paint Lumumba as dangerous. In January 1961, he was arrested, beaten, and handed over to his enemies. Stripped of dignity, bound, and tortured, Lumumba was executed in secret, his body desecrated and destroyed to erase all trace of him. The brutality of his death was matched only by the silence that followed, as international governments turned their heads away from their own complicity. For the Congolese people, it was not only the loss of a leader, but the destruction of a dream. That freedom could mean true independence rather than a new form of control. Lumumba's assassination reveals the darkest truth about power. When the cry for justice threatens the interests of the powerful, truth itself becomes disposable. It shows how leaders who dare to speak for the oppressed are often condemned to die, their deaths hidden under the guise of stability. His voice was stolen, but his absence became a haunting presence, a reminder of how hope can be betrayed and how the chains of exploitation are rarely broken without blood. The coup in Chile, 1973. The coup in Chile on September 11, 1973, was not only the fall of a government, it was the shattering of a nation's soul. That morning, fighter jets roared over Santiago, bombing La Moneda Palace as President Salvador Allende gave his final address to the people he had sworn to serve. By nightfall, the democratically elected leader was dead, and General Augusto Pinochet seized power, plunging Chile into a dictatorship built on fear, silence, and blood. The streets became hunting grounds for anyone suspected of supporting Allende's government. Thousands were rounded up, tortured in secret prisons, and executed without trial. The National Stadium, once a place of celebration, was turned into a cage of horror, where cries of the beaten echoed against concrete walls. Families waited for news of loved ones who never returned, while disappeared bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their names erased, but their absence unbearable. The coup was not only an attack on Chile's democracy, it was a betrayal fueled by foreign interference and corporate greed, with the United States and multinational interests backing Pinochet's rise to protect economic power. The human cost was drowned in propaganda, while ordinary Chileans learned to live in constant fear, speaking only in whispers, watching neighbors vanish overnight. The coup in Chile teaches a lesson etched in grief, how fragile democracy becomes when power, money, and fear conspire to strangle the voice of the people. It shows how terror can be cloaked as stability, and how silence can be enforced not only by guns, but by the disappearance of those who dared to dream of a different future. Apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa was not merely a system of segregation, it was a calculated machinery of dehumanization that reduced millions of people to shadows in their own homeland. From 1948 to the early 1990s, laws divided the nation by skin color, stripping Black South Africans of basic rights, dignity, and freedom, while elevating a white minority into absolute power. Families were torn from ancestral lands and forced into barren homelands. Passports were required just to move within their own country, and education was deliberately crippled to ensure subservience. Daily life became a prison built not of walls, but of laws designed to suffocate hope. The cruelty lay not only in restrictions, but in the deliberate crushing of the human spirit. Police patrolled with brutality, dissenters were jailed or killed, and ordinary people lived in constant fear of punishment for simply existing outside the confines forced upon them. Children grew up watching their parents humiliated, neighbors disappeared into detention without trial, and entire communities carried the weight of being treated as less than human. And yet, within that darkness, the will to resist refused to die. From secret classrooms to underground movements, from whispered songs to defiant protests, the oppressed fought for their right to breathe freely. But the cost was immense. Blood spilled in townships, voices silenced in prison cells, families shattered under the weight of injustice. Apartheid is a reminder of how power can cloak itself in legality while carrying out cruelty, and how hatred can be disguised as policy. Its scars remain etched into the soil of South Africa, a lesson in how deeply oppression can root itself when humanity is divided by walls of race, fear, and greed. The Long March of Mao's China. The Long March of Mao's China was more than a military retreat. It was a grueling odyssey of suffering that swallowed lives by the tens of thousands. Beginning in 1934, the Chinese Communist Red Army, surrounded and battered by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, was forced into a desperate retreat across some of the harshest terrain on earth. Nearly 100,000 soldiers set out on a trek that would last over a year, covering more than 6,000 miles through mountains, swamps, and frozen plateaus. By the end, barely a fraction survived. The march was a living nightmare. Soldiers trudged barefoot across snowbound peaks, their skin splitting from frostbite, while others drowned in swamps or collapsed from hunger on barren plains. Rivers ran with the bodies of those too weak to continue, and battle after battle bled the army dry. Survivors shared scraps of food, gnawed on leather, and buried comrades in shallow graves before forcing themselves forward. It was not just the enemy they fought, it was starvation, disease, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of despair. Yet what makes the Long March so haunting is how it became mythologized. The unimaginable suffering of the rank and file was later polished into propaganda, their deaths turned into symbols to glorify Mao's rise. The reality of shattered bodies and broken spirits was buried beneath the narrative of heroism, while the voices of those who perished were silenced. The Long March reveals how history can be rewritten to mass tragedy, how human lives can be consumed to fuel a leader's legacy. It is a reminder that endurance, when stolen by force, becomes less about courage and more about survival at the edge of death. The footsteps of the marchers remain carved into the earth, echoing both sacrifice and the cruelty of ambition. The Zong Massacre of enslaved Africans, 1781. The Zong Massacre was not only an atrocity, it was the transformation of human lives into numbers on a ledger. In 1781, aboard the British slave ship Zong, over 130 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard into the sea, chained and drowning in the endless black waters of the Atlantic. This was not done out of desperation, but calculation. The crew claimed the ship was running low on water and argued that the captives were cargo, whose deaths would allow the owners to collect insurance money. Lives were reduced to profit margins, and the ocean became their grave. The horror did not end in the waves. When the massacre was revealed in England, it was not tried as murder, but as a property dispute. The courts debated not the humanity of the men, women, and children who perished, but whether the ship's owners should be compensated for their losses. No one was convicted, and justice for the drowned never came. The silence of the law screamed louder than the cries of those suffocated beneath the water. The Zong Massacre exposes the darkest face of slavery, the complete erasure of personhood, where people were transformed into commodities and their deaths became mere transactions. It teaches how greed blinds humanity, how law can become complicit in cruelty, and how memory itself is often left to drown with the victims. The ocean still carries their story, whispering through its tides the chilling truth that when life is measured only in profit, the depths of human evil have no limit. The expulsion of Jews from Spain, 1492. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 was not only a decree of exile, it was the tearing apart of centuries of life, culture, and faith under the shadow of fear and greed. With the signing of the Alhambra Decree by Ferdinand and Isabella, Spain ordered every Jew to convert to Christianity or abandon their homeland within months. Families who had lived on Iberian soil for generations, who had built thriving communities, enriched the arts, sciences, and trade, suddenly became strangers overnight, unwanted in the land they had helped shape. Those who left faced a journey filled with suffering. Ships carried them into storms and seas where many drowned, while others were robbed, enslaved, or left to starve. Roads out of Spain became rivers of tears as children clung to their parents, elders stumbled from exhaustion, and whole communities disintegrated under the weight of loss. Those who converted to stay were never safe, haunted by the Inquisition, accused of heresy, tortured, and burned for practicing their faith in secret. No choice was without terror: exile, forced conversion, or death. The expulsion was more than an act of religious intolerance. It was a calculated theft. Jewish families were forced to sell their homes, lands, and businesses for almost nothing, their wealth absorbed by those eager to profit from their suffering. A society that had once thrived in coexistence was broken by fanaticism and power. The lesson of 1492 is a dark truth. When fear and intolerance rule, neighbors become enemies, and humanity is sacrificed to dogma and greed. The cries of the expelled still echo, a reminder of how easily belonging can be stripped away, leaving only ashes and memory in its place. The Holocaust ignored victims. The Holocaust is remembered as one of history's darkest chapters, yet even within its vast horror, some voices remain silenced beneath the weight of selective memory. While the world recognizes the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews, countless others, Roma and Sinti people, the disabled, homosexuals, political prisoners, and anyone deemed undesirable, were also swept into the machinery of death. Their suffering was no less brutal, yet their stories were pushed to the margins, forgotten in the shadows of history's narrative. For the Roma, entire caravans were hunted down and annihilated, their vibrant culture nearly erased as families were rounded up and sent to camps where starvation and gas chambers awaited. For the disabled, the cruelty was even more chilling. Children and adults labeled as life unworthy of life were subjected to forced sterilizations, medical experiments, or quietly killed under the T4 program, a state-sponsored extermination masked as mercy. Political prisoners, dissenters, and anyone who dared to resist the regime were marked with colored triangles on their uniforms, stripped not only of freedom but of identity, condemned to die nameless in camps built to grind hope into dust. The ignored victims of the Holocaust remind us that atrocity does not discriminate in its cruelty. It expands to consume all who do not fit the mold of power's obsession. Their silence reveals a darker truth, that even in remembering, society can choose whose suffering is worthy of acknowledgement and whose is easier to forget. This lesson haunts us with a question more piercing than memory itself. If we overlook the pain of some, do we not risk repeating the same cruelty that once tried to erase them entirely? The Jonestown Massacre, 1978. The Jonestown Massacre is one of the most chilling examples of how devotion can be twisted into destruction when blind faith collides with manipulation. In 1978, more than 900 followers of the People's Temple, led by the charismatic yet tyrannical Jim Jones, perished in the jungles of Guyana. What began as a promise of equality, community, and utopia soon devolved into a nightmare of control, paranoia, and terror. Members were cut off from the outside world, their letters censored, their movements watched, their spirits broken under the weight of constant fear. Jones demanded absolute loyalty, presenting himself as both savior and ruler. He preyed on the vulnerable, using a toxic mix of love and intimidation to bind his followers to him. When doubt surfaced, he silenced it with threats, staged suicide rehearsals, and conditioned people to believe their lives belonged entirely to him. By the time U.S. officials arrived to investigate, the cult was already at its breaking point. On November 18, 1978, Jones commanded his followers to drink a poisoned fruit punch. Mothers gave it to their children first, many forced to watch their sons and daughters convulse and die in their arms before taking it themselves. Those who resisted were coerced at gunpoint. Nearly an entire community lay dead within hours, their bodies sprawled across the compound, their dreams of paradise drowned in cyanide. The Jonestown Massacre is a harrowing lesson in the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of the desperate, and the terrifying ease with which one man's delusion can annihilate hundreds of lives. It is the echo of voices silenced by trust, betrayed, a reminder that devotion without question can lead straight into the abyss. The Ghost Dance Massacre at Wounded Knee, 1890. The Ghost Dance Massacre at Wounded Knee was not a battle, but a slaughter, the crushing of a people's last hope beneath the boots of fear and power. In December 1890, on the frozen plains of South Dakota, hundreds of Lakota Sioux, men, women, and children, gathered under the vision of the Ghost Dance, a spiritual movement promising renewal, the return of buffalo, and the fading of colonial oppression. To the U.S. government, this prayer for survival was twisted into a threat. Soldiers surrounded the camp at Wounded Knee Creek, demanding disarmament. Tension sparked, and in an instant, rifles opened fire. Chaos erupted as cannons tore into the encampment, mowing down families who had no chance to defend themselves. Mothers fell clutching infants, children fled only to be hunted in the snow, and elders collapsed in prayer as bullets ripped through them. The massacre left more than 250 Lakota dead, their bodies strewn across the icy ground, frozen where they fell. The soldiers' victory was celebrated with medals, while the cries of the slain were buried in silence. The tragedy of Wounded Knee is not only in the blood spilled, but in what it symbolized: the death of native resistance, the silencing of a sacred dream, and the extinguishing of hope for a people already broken by broken treaties and stolen lands. It is a lesson in how fear can twist spirituality into danger, how power will crush even prayer when it threatens control. The snow at Wounded Knee became stained with more than blood. It became a reminder that hope itself can be feared, and that even songs of survival can be silenced with gunfire. The Haitian Massacre of 1804. The Haitian Massacre of 1804 was born from centuries of cruelty, a brutal answer to the horrors of slavery and colonization. Haiti, having fought and won its freedom from French rule, stood as the first black republic in the world, a beacon of resistance against oppression. But freedom came with scars, too deep to heal quietly. After years of torture, enslavement, and dehumanization inflicted by French colonists, rage exploded into vengeance. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's revolutionary leader, ordered the extermination of the remaining French population on the island. Men, women, and children were hunted down in their homes, their blood soaking the same soil that had once been watered by the sweat and suffering of the enslaved. The massacre was swift and merciless. Families who had lived in Haiti for generations were slaughtered, and entire communities vanished in a matter of weeks. To the new nation, it was seen as a way to secure survival, an assurance that their freedom would never again be stolen by those who had once treated them as property. But beneath that reasoning lay a darkness, the cycle of violence consuming the oppressed and the oppressor alike, leaving only grief and silence where reconciliation might have been possible. The Haitian Massacre is a lesson drenched in sorrow. It reveals how brutality, when left to fester unchecked, breeds vengeance so fierce it cannot distinguish between guilt and innocence. It shows how centuries of dehumanization can ignite a fire that consumes everything in its path, leaving behind a freedom won at a cost too heavy to bear. The cries of both the enslaved and the slain echo together, a haunting reminder that when justice is denied, vengeance often rises in its place. The Great Fire of Smyrna, 1922. The Great Fire of Smyrna in 1922 was not just a blaze that consumed a city, it was the violent erasure of a people's history carried out under the cover of war. When Turkish nationalist forces captured Smyrna at the end of the Greco-Turkish War, chaos erupted, and within days, flames tore through the Armenian and Greek quarters. What might have begun as the conquest of territory became an inferno of extermination, with entire communities swallowed by fire. Homes, schools, and churches, centuries of culture, were reduced to ash, and the harbor filled with desperate men, women, and children trapped between the advancing flames and the indifferent sea. The agony was unbearable. Families huddled on the waterfront as the fire raged behind them, screaming for help from foreign ships anchored nearby. Their pleas met with silence. Mothers clutched infants as smoke blackened the sky. Fathers collapsed trying to shield loved ones, and thousands perished in the flames or drowned in frantic attempts to escape. The survivors who did manage to flee carried nothing but their grief, leaving behind not just possessions, but entire worlds of memory and belonging. What makes Smyrna's tragedy so devastating is not only the fire itself, but the deliberate nature of its destruction. The blaze targeted specific districts, eradicating Armenian and Greek life while sparing others, ensuring that culture itself was incinerated alongside human lives. And then came denial. Records obscured, blame shifted, history rewritten to mask the scale of the atrocity. The Great Fire of Smyrna is a lesson in how violence does not end with death. It continues in silence, in the attempt to erase memory itself, leaving descendants to inherit not just loss, but the burden of forgotten truth. The Great Leap Forward Disasters, 1958 to 1962. The Great Leap Forward was a catastrophic experiment where ideology eclipsed humanity, and the price was paid in millions of lives. Launched in 1958 by Mao Zedong, it promised to catapult China into modern industrial glory, but instead it unleashed famine, chaos, and despair on a scale few could imagine. Farmers were forced to abandon their fields, to build backyard furnaces, melting pots and pans into useless steel, while officials inflated harvest numbers to please the regime. As a result, grain was seized for the state, warehouses overflowed, and yet villages starved in silence. The countryside became a graveyard. Starvation hollowed out entire families, leaving children with distended bellies, elders collapsing in the fields, and parents forced into unthinkable choices of survival. Reports of cannibalism emerged from villages where the living were too weak to bury the dead, and the silence of those who perished was buried beneath layers of propaganda. To admit hunger was dangerous, for speaking the truth branded one a traitor. Fear kept mouths shut, even as millions withered away in plain sight. The tragedy of the Great Leap Forward is not only in the deaths, but in their cause. It was not drought or disease, but human arrogance and denial that created one of history's deadliest famines. Leaders shielded themselves with false reports, while ordinary people were stripped of dignity, voice, and even the right to survive. The disaster shows how power, when deaf to suffering, can turn a nation into a prison of silence. The Great Leap Forward is a chilling lesson that ambition, when placed above human life, can become more destructive than any weapon. The Partition Massacres of Punjab. The Partition Massacres of Punjab were not random outbreaks of violence, but a tidal wave of blood unleashed by the carving of a border. In 1947, when British India was split into India and Pakistan, Punjab became the epicenter of chaos, its villages and cities torn apart by lines drawn on a map. What followed was a human tragedy of unimaginable scale. Neighbors who had shared festivals, meals, and marriages suddenly turned against each other, consumed by fear, vengeance, and propaganda. The land was drenched in violence as trains arrived, at stations filled, not with refugees, but with corpses, their silence screaming louder than any words. Entire caravans of families were ambushed on dusty roads, hacked to pieces as they fled toward what they believed would be safety. Women faced horrors too brutal to speak, raped, kidnapped, or killed to preserve honor, their suffering hidden behind walls of shame. Children were torn from their parents, left to wander in the carnage, while elders collapsed on journeys too long for their fragile bodies to endure. The massacres claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, while millions more were scarred with wounds too deep to ever heal. The Partition of Punjab teaches the devastating speed at which identity can be weaponized. Religion, once a bond of coexistence, was twisted into a reason for slaughter, and centuries of brotherhood crumbled in a matter of weeks. The soil of Punjab became a graveyard of trust, where every scream and every silence carried the weight of betrayal. It is a haunting reminder that when power divides people with borders and fear, it is humanity itself that bleeds into the ground. The Einsatzgruppen Killings, World War II. The Einsatzgruppen Killings during World War II were genocide in its rawest, most intimate form, murder carried out not by distant bombs or anonymous camps, but face-to-face in fields, forests, and villages where the victims once lived their ordinary lives. These mobile death squads followed the German army into Eastern Europe, rounding up Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable, forcing them to dig their own graves before being executed in mass shootings. Entire communities were erased in a single day, their bodies piled into pits while their voices were smothered under the soil. What makes the lesson so chilling is the cold familiarity of the killers. These were not monsters born in darkness. They were ordinary men, policemen, teachers, and clerks, transformed into executioners by ideology and obedience. They laughed, ate, and smoked cigarettes between killings, treating mass murder as routine work. Villagers, once neighbors, watched helplessly or were forced to participate, leaving behind trauma that scarred generations. The Einsatzgruppen Killings reveal the terrifying ease with which ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when hatred is normalized and authority commands it. Unlike the industrialized death of the gas chambers, these murders were carried out up close, bullets tearing through men holding their children, mothers shielding infants who were slaughtered alongside them. The intimacy of the violence stripped away every illusion of detachment. Hatred was delivered directly, with eyes meeting eyes as life was stolen. This chapter of history warns us how quickly humanity can be stripped from both victim and perpetrator. It shows that genocide is not only planned in offices or written into laws, but carried out in open fields by hands that look just like our own, leaving behind graves that whisper the danger of silence and blind obedience. The war crimes of King Leopold II. The reign of King Leopold II over the Congo Free State was one of the most grotesque examples of exploitation disguised as civilization. From 1885 to 1908, under his personal rule, the Congo became a vast labor camp where millions of Africans were enslaved, mutilated, and murdered in the name of profit. Villagers were forced to harvest rubber under impossible quotas, their lives reduced to numbers that determined whether they would be spared or destroyed. Failure to meet demands often meant beatings, executions, or the severing of hands. Grotesque trophies taken to prove that bullets had not been wasted. The cruelty spread like wildfire. Soldiers raided villages, taking women and children hostage to coerce men into labor, while starvation and disease swept through communities already broken by violence. Entire regions were depopulated, with an estimated 10 million lives lost during Leopold's reign of terror. The wealth of Europe grew fat from Congo's suffering, while the people who bled for it were left in silence, their screams drowned beneath propaganda that painted the atrocities as benevolent progress. What makes Leopold's crimes so haunting is not just the scale of death, but the hypocrisy that fueled them. He presented himself as a humanitarian, while his agents turned the Congo into a slaughterhouse. Photographs of severed hands and starving children eventually exposed the truth, but the damage had already been done. Millions gone, cultures shattered, and lands scarred with grief. The lesson of Leopold's Congo is a chilling reminder of how greed cloaked in morality can unleash destruction beyond imagination, and how the thirst for wealth can transform one man's ambition into a genocide that the world tried too long to forget. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Cover-up motives. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 is often remembered as the spark that ignited World War I, but buried beneath the official story lies a web of cover-ups and concealed motives. On that summer day in Sarajevo, a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired the shots that killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife. Yet what followed was less about justice and more about manipulation, as powerful figures twisted the tragedy into a justification for war they had long been preparing to wage. The assassination was not an isolated act of rebellion, but part of a larger storm fueled by nationalism, secret societies, and imperial ambitions. The Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group, plotted the killing, but evidence suggests the reach of responsibility went far beyond a single band of radicals. The Austro-Hungarian government, instead of investigating fully, seized the opportunity to pin blame squarely on Serbia, ignoring inconvenient truths that pointed to broader conspiracies. Their goal was not truth, it was conquest. By weaponizing the Archduke's death, they manufactured a casus belli to crush Serbian resistance and secure greater dominance in the Balkans. The silence surrounding certain details, warnings ignored, security mysteriously lax, political interests conveniently aligned, suggests the assassination was not just tragedy, but opportunity. The world was dragged into a war that consumed millions of lives, justified by a story crafted to conceal ambition beneath the veil of vengeance. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand teaches us how death can be repurposed into propaganda, how truth can be buried beneath the rubble of war, and how a single bullet, when manipulated by power, can ignite a global inferno. The Siege of Leningrad. Starvation. The Siege of Leningrad was not only a military blockade, it was a slow-motion genocide carried out through hunger. From 1941 to 1944, the city of Leningrad was encircled by Nazi forces, its supply lines severed, its people trapped in a frozen cage of despair. What followed was nearly 900 days of unimaginable suffering. Food vanished, rations dwindled to crumbs, and families tore wallpaper from their walls to boil the paste for nourishment. People ate sawdust mixed with flour, leather belts, even the flesh of animals once kept as pets. Hunger hollowed faces, turned bodies skeletal, and carved despair into the soul of a city. Winter made the suffering unbearable. Temperatures plunged below freezing, and fuel was gone. Families huddled in dark, unheated rooms, clutching each other for warmth, while outside, corpses froze stiff in the streets, too many to bury. Mothers watched their children starve, torn between love and survival, while rumors of cannibalism spread, a haunting reflection of how far desperation can drive the human spirit. More than 1 million people perished, most not by bullets or bombs, but by the silent, gnawing cruelty of starvation. What makes this tragedy even darker is the endurance it demanded. The people of Leningrad were forced to resist not only an enemy at their gates, but the daily pull of hunger, cold, and despair. It revealed the terrifying fragility of life when food is turned into a weapon of war. The siege of Leningrad shows that starvation is not just the absence of food, it is the deliberate breaking of human will, a cruelty as sharp as any blade, leaving scars that outlived even the war itself. The Dreyfus Affair 1894 to 1906. The Dreyfus Affair was not only a miscarriage of justice, it was the public unmasking of how deep hatred and prejudice can rot the very foundations of a nation. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason, convicted on fabricated evidence, and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, a desolate prison off the coast of South America. His real crime was not betrayal, but being Jewish in a society poisoned by anti-Semitism. The trial was a spectacle of lies. Secret documents were forged, evidence suppressed, and whispers of conspiracy echoed through newspapers, eager to fan flames of hatred. Crowds jeered his name in the streets, convinced of his guilt before proof could ever be shown. His family was left broken, clinging to hope, while France itself tore apart over whether truth or prejudice would prevail. The deeper tragedy was how many in power knew he was innocent but chose silence, protecting the army's reputation over justice, allowing one man's life to be destroyed to shield their own pride. The Dreyfus Affair teaches a chilling lesson. When prejudice drives justice, truth becomes its first victim. It shows how entire societies can be manipulated into rage by fear and hatred, how crowds can chant for blood without questioning the lies that fuel their anger. The affair left France scarred, exposing the fragility of democracy when hatred is allowed to define who is guilty and who is worthy of protection. The echoes of Dreyfus' chains on Devil's Island still warn that when a society condemns someone for who they are rather than what they have done, it is not only one man who suffers, it is justice itself. The suppression of the Paris Commune, 1871. The suppression of the Paris Commune in 1871 was not simply the defeat of a political uprising, it was the merciless slaughter of a dream. For 72 days, the workers and poor of Paris seized their city, daring to imagine a society built on equality, self-governance, and justice. They dismantled old hierarchies, challenged oppression, and lit a spark of hope that terrified the ruling elite of France. But when the government in Versailles moved to crush the Commune, hope was drowned in a sea of blood. During what became known as La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, troops stormed Paris with unrelenting fury. Barricades fell one by one as soldiers massacred men, women, and even children accused of supporting the Commune. The streets became execution grounds where suspected communards were lined up and shot without trial. Entire neighborhoods burned, leaving behind charred ruins that smelled of both fire and death. The Seine ran thick with corpses, and the city of light was plunged into a darkness deeper than night. The horror of the suppression lay not only in its brutality, but in the betrayal it symbolized. Ordinary workers had dared to dream of dignity, only to be branded criminals and annihilated by the very state that claimed to protect them. Tens of thousands were executed, deported, or imprisoned, their voices silenced, their vision buried under rubble. The lesson of the Paris Commune is a warning etched in ash and blood. When those in power feel threatened by the hope of the oppressed, they will stop at nothing to extinguish it, leaving behind scars that whisper of what might have been. The Katyn Forest Massacre Denial. The Katyn Forest Massacre is not only remembered for the brutality of the act, but for the decades of denial that followed, where truth itself became a victim. In 1940, under Stalin's orders, Soviet secret police executed more than 20,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war. They were shot in the back of the head, their bodies dumped into mass graves hidden beneath the trees of Katyn. These men were not soldiers on a battlefield, they were captives, stripped of weapons, murdered to decapitate Poland's leadership and weaken its future. Yet as haunting as the massacre was, the silence that followed was even more sinister. When the graves were discovered by the Nazis in 1943, the Soviets denied responsibility, blaming the very enemy they were fighting. For decades, the lie held strong, reinforced by propaganda, intimidation, and the willingness of Allied powers to look away. Families of the murdered men lived in torment, forced to endure not only the loss of their loved ones, but the insult of a lie that branded the truth as treachery. Speaking out meant persecution, exile, or imprisonment. The denial was as much a weapon as the bullet, erasing memory, silencing grief, and distorting history for political convenience. It wasn't until 1990 that Russia officially admitted Soviet responsibility, but by then, generations had grown up under a shadow of deceit. The Katyn Forest Massacre shows how denial can deepen wounds more than death itself. It teaches us that when truth is buried beneath lies, the dead cannot rest, and the living cannot heal. It is a chilling lesson in how power manipulates memory, rewriting history to serve its own survival while silencing the cries of those who can no longer speak. The Chechen Wars atrocities. The Chechen Wars were not simply battles for territory. They were brutal campaigns where civilians became the true targets, their lives crushed between politics, nationalism, and vengeance. From the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, as Russia fought to keep Chechnya under its control, the small republic was turned into a landscape of rubble and silence. Cities like Grozny were reduced to ash by relentless bombardments. Neighborhoods, once filled with laughter, flattened into graveyards of stone and dust. For the people who lived there, survival meant enduring a nightmare where every day carried the stench of blood and burning homes. The atrocities were relentless. Entire families were executed in cleansing operations. Men disappeared into detention centers where torture was routine, and women were left to search for sons and husbands who never returned. Children grew up surrounded by the sounds of artillery and the sight of corpses in the streets, their innocence stolen before they ever had a chance to live. Rape, looting, and collective punishment became weapons of war, breaking communities apart and leaving behind scars that no rebuilding could erase. What makes the Chechen Wars so haunting is the silence that followed. The world looked away, distracted or unwilling to confront the scale of cruelty, while survivors carried the unbearable weight of memories too dangerous to voice. It is a lesson in how power can justify any horror when cloaked in the language of security and order, and how easily human suffering is forgotten when it belongs to the powerless. The soil of Chechnya is heavy with ghosts, each one a reminder that in war, the greatest casualty is always the innocent. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki aftermath, censorship. The aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not just devastation, it was silence, enforced by censorship that buried the cries of the living beneath the weight of politics. When the atomic bombs fell in August 1945, the world saw only blinding flashes and mushroom clouds, but what lingered was far more horrifying. Entire cities were reduced to ash, and tens of thousands were incinerated instantly, their shadows burned into walls. Those who survived staggered through ruins, with skin peeling from their bodies, their mouths too dry to scream, their eyes clouded by burns. Yet when the war ended, the U.S. government seized control of the story, forbidding photographs, films, and reports that showed the true human cost of the bombings. Hospitals overflowed with victims suffering from radiation sickness, their hair falling out in clumps, their organs failing, their bodies wasting away, while doctors struggled to understand the unseen poison consuming them. Children born in the years that followed carried deformities. Mothers wept over stillborn infants, and entire generations bore scars that were denied existence because they contradicted the narrative of victory. Journalists who tried to document the suffering had their work confiscated, their voices muted so the world would never fully see the torment left behind. The censorship of Hiroshima and Nagasaki's aftermath teaches a dark truth. When governments fear the weight of their own actions, they rewrite reality itself. By silencing survivors, erasing images, and muting testimony, the truth was hidden under patriotism, leaving the victims to suffer in the shadows of history. The lesson is etched in silence as much as in fire. When truth is buried, the wounds of the living become invisible, but no less agonizing. The Great Fire of London's Plague, Death's Cover-Up. The Great Fire of London in 1666 is remembered as the blaze that consumed the medieval heart of the city, but hidden beneath the flames lies a darker truth, its connection to the plague that had ravaged London the year before. Official accounts claimed around 100,000 had perished in the Great Plague of 1665, yet many historians believe the numbers were far higher, and the fire became a convenient cloak to hide the true scale of devastation. As the inferno tore through the city, consuming homes, records, and burial grounds, it also destroyed the evidence of just how many lives the plague had claimed, leaving future generations with only fragments of the truth. The suffering was unbearable. Families had already endured months of plague, where corpses piled in the streets, carts collected the dead by night, and red crosses marked the doors of infected houses. Whole households vanished in silence, their names buried in mass graves. When the fire struck, survivors found themselves running from one horror into another, forced to abandon not just possessions but the graves of loved ones whose existence would be erased by ash. The cover-up was as much political as it was practical. Leaders wanted to restore order and rebuild confidence in a shaken city, and admitting the true extent of plague deaths threatened to expose the fragility of their rule. By letting the fire erase the records, they buried both the bodies and the truth. The Great Fire of London is not only a story of flames, but of silence, a reminder of how governments can manipulate catastrophe to hide their failures, leaving grief unspoken and history scarred by omission. The Japanese-American internment camps, 1942 to 1945. The Japanese-American internment camps of World War II remain one of the darkest betrayals of trust in American history, when fear and prejudice outweighed justice and humanity. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. government cast suspicion on an entire community, branding over 120,000 Japanese Americans as potential enemies simply because of their ancestry. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to abandon their homes, businesses, and possessions. Armed soldiers herded them onto trains and buses, transporting them to desolate camps behind barbed wire, guarded by watchtowers as if they were prisoners of war. Inside the camps, life was defined by loss and indignity. Families were crammed into crude barracks with no insulation, enduring blistering summers and freezing winters. Privacy vanished as multiple families shared small quarters, and meals were eaten in mess halls under military supervision. Doctors, teachers, and shopkeepers who had built lives of dignity were reduced to numbers, stripped of their rights, and branded as threats to the nation they called home. Children grew up under guard, their innocence overshadowed by a lesson in rejection from the very country of their birth. The cruelty was not only in the confinement, but in the silence. No acts of espionage were ever proven, yet lives were destroyed, businesses lost, and entire generations scarred by the weight of suspicion. Even as young Japanese Americans volunteered to fight and die for the United States in the war, their families remained behind fences, guilty of nothing but their heritage. The internment camps reveal how quickly fear can unravel freedom, how prejudice can disguise itself as patriotism, and how fragile justice becomes when security is placed above humanity. It is a wound in American history carved by betrayal, silence, and the shadows of barbed wire. The Soviet Gulags. The Soviet Gulags were not just prisons, they were vast engines of suffering designed to crush bodies and break spirits under the weight of silence. From the 1930s through the 1950s, millions of people, peasants, intellectuals, political dissidents, and even ordinary citizens accused of imaginary crimes were swallowed into a system of forced labor camps scattered across the frozen wilderness of Siberia. Once inside, survival became a daily gamble. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and driven to exhaustion as they cut timber, mined coal, or built railroads in sub-zero temperatures with nothing but rags to shield them from the cold. The gulags thrived on despair. Families were ripped apart, with fathers taken in the night, mothers left to explain to children why their loved one had vanished. Inmates slept on lice-infested boards, their bodies skeletal from hunger, their breath crystallizing in the freezing air. Disease swept through the barracks unchecked, and guards treated life as disposable, a resource as cheap as the labor extracted. Countless prisoners collapsed mid-task, buried in unmarked graves, their names erased, their stories silenced. What makes the Gulag so chilling is not only the scale of suffering, but the deliberate dehumanization behind it. Entire populations were reduced to statistics, written off as enemies of the people, while their agony built the infrastructure of an empire. The world outside was told little, while those within learned that truth itself could be imprisoned. The gulags teach the darkest lesson. When a state holds the power to define who is human, cruelty becomes limitless, and survival itself becomes an act of rebellion against oblivion. The Massacre of the Harkis, 1962. The Massacre of the Harkis in 1962 was a tragedy of betrayal, where loyalty was repaid with blood. During the Algerian War of Independence, thousands of Muslim Algerians, the Harkis, fought alongside French forces, believing promises of protection and a future once the war ended. But when Algeria finally won independence, those promises were abandoned. The French government, unwilling or unable to evacuate most of the Harkis, left them trapped in a land where they were branded as traitors. What followed was not reconciliation, but slaughter. In villages across Algeria, Harkis were hunted down with vengeance. Men were tortured in ways too brutal to imagine, burned alive, mutilated, hacked apart before the eyes of their families. Women and children suffered unspeakable violence, forced to watch as their fathers and brothers were executed, their homes set ablaze, their futures erased in fire and blood. Estimates say tens of thousands were killed, their cries vanishing into a silence the world rarely acknowledged. Those few who managed to escape to France carried wounds that went far beyond the physical. They arrived to find themselves unwanted, forced into camps, and shunned by the very nation they had served. Their children grew up in the shadow of stigma, taught by silence that their parents' sacrifice had been both forgotten and despised. The Massacre of the Harkis stands as a brutal lesson in how easily allies are discarded when they are no longer useful. It shows the cruelty of abandonment, the way loyalty can become a death sentence, and how betrayal deepens the scars of war long after the last shot is fired. The echoes of 1962 still remind us that promises broken can kill just as surely as bullets. The Sharpeville Massacre, 1960. The Sharpeville Massacre was a moment when the brutality of apartheid revealed itself to the world in the most horrifying way. On March 21, 1960, thousands of black South Africans gathered peacefully in Sharpeville to protest the hated pass laws that dictated where they could live, work, and move. It was an act of defiance against a system that stripped them of dignity, demanding that they carry documents to justify their presence in their own land. What began as a non-violent stand for freedom ended in blood as police opened fire on unarmed men, women, and children without warning. In less than 2 minutes, nearly 70 people lay dead, many shot in the back as they fled, and more than 180 were wounded. The ground was soaked with blood, mothers screamed over fallen children, and the air filled with the cries of a community shattered by bullets meant to silence them. Survivors recalled the chaos of panic, bodies piling in the streets, people trampled as they tried to escape, the sound of gunfire refusing to stop, even as the crowd scattered. What makes Sharpeville so devastating is not only the loss of life, but the cold intent behind it. This was not a battle, not an exchange of arms. It was the state declaring that black lives had no value, that even peaceful protest could be answered with slaughter. The massacre ignited global outrage, exposing apartheid for what it truly was, a system built on violence and fear. Yet for those who lived through that day, the lesson was carved in blood, that seeking justice in a world determined to deny it can come at the highest price, and that silence in the face of oppression is itself a weapon. The Banana Massacre in Colombia, 1928. The Banana Massacre of 1928 is a brutal story of how human lives were sacrificed to protect profit, and how truth was buried under silence and fear. In the town of Ciénaga, Colombia, thousands of workers for the United Fruit Company went on strike, demanding fair wages, humane working conditions, and basic dignity. Families filled the streets with peaceful protests, believing their voices could no longer be ignored. But instead of negotiation, they were met with rifles. The Colombian army, under pressure from both the company and the United States, opened fire on unarmed men, women, and children gathered in the town square. The ground was stained with blood, and the air filled with screams as the massacre unfolded. Estimates of the dead vary. Some say dozens, others say hundreds, and some whisper thousands. But the true number remains shrouded in secrecy, deliberately erased by those who stood to lose power and money. Bodies were piled onto trains, carted away, and dumped into the sea or buried in mass graves as if their very existence could be erased along with the crime. Survivors were silenced by fear, their voices suppressed in a country where speaking out meant persecution. The Banana Massacre is a chilling reminder of how corporations and governments can collude to crush the powerless, disguising greed as order and brutality as necessity. It shows how the cries of workers can be drowned out by gunfire, and how justice can be smothered beneath the weight of silence. The town square of Ciénaga remains haunted by that day, its soil heavy with the blood of those who dared to demand dignity, only to be answered with bullets. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan after Reconstruction. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan after Reconstruction was not just the birth of a hate group, it was the resurrection of slavery's shadow in another form. Following the Civil War, when emancipation promised freedom to millions of formerly enslaved people, terror rose to chain them once again. Cloaked in white hoods and robes, the Klan emerged in the South as the invisible army of fear, spreading violence to restore white supremacy. Their message was carved not in words but in blood and fire. Freedmen who tried to vote were lynched from trees, teachers of black children were whipped or murdered, and families woke in the night to see burning crosses outside their homes, knowing death might follow. The Klan thrived because silence protected it. Local governments often turned a blind eye, and in many places, law enforcement itself was complicit. Entire communities were held hostage by fear, where speaking out meant becoming the next victim. Through intimidation, the Klan dismantled the fragile gains of Reconstruction, turning freedom into a hollow word. Segregation and Jim Crow laws flourished in the wake of their terror, ensuring that equality promised on paper remained a cruel illusion in practice. What makes this lesson so haunting is the way hate disguised itself as tradition and justice. The Klan cloaked barbarity in symbols of religion and patriotism, twisting faith and pride into weapons. Its rise reveals how fragile progress becomes when prejudice festers unchecked, and how terror, when woven into the fabric of society, can outlast generations. The hood and the noose remain symbols not just of violence, but of how easily freedom can be strangled when justice looks away. The Boxer Rebellion, Reprisals, 1900. The Boxer Rebellion, reprisals of 1900 were not justice. They were vengeance carried out on a nation already fractured by humiliation and foreign intrusion. When the Boxer movement rose in China, Fueled by desperation and rage against imperial exploitation, foreign powers responded with overwhelming force. After the siege of Beijing was broken, the so-called Allied forces, 8 powerful nations including Britain, Japan, Germany, Russia, and the United States, unleashed a wave of retribution across northern China that turned rebellion into massacre. Villages were burned to the ground, entire communities slaughtered for the crime of being suspected sympathizers. Soldiers executed peasants in the streets, raped women, and looted homes, temples, and palaces with a greed that stripped China not only of lives but of dignity. The Forbidden City itself was violated, treasures stolen, while civilians were forced to watch their heritage carted away as spoils of war. Thousands were hanged or shot without trial, their deaths justified as punishment but serving only as demonstrations of power. What makes this lesson so harrowing is that the reprisals were calculated acts of domination, designed to remind China of its helplessness. The peace settlement that followed, the Boxer Protocol, imposed crushing financial reparations, foreign military occupation, and yet more humiliation upon a wounded nation. China was left broken, not just in body, but in spirit, its sovereignty shredded by those who claimed to bring civilization. The reprisals after the Boxer Rebellion show how imperial powers cloaked greed and cruelty in the language of order. They reveal how punishment can become atrocity, how justice can be twisted into terror, and how nations can be made to bleed not only from rebellion, but from the crushing hand of revenge. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 1943. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was born from desperation, a final act of defiance against a machine of annihilation. In 1943, the Jewish inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto, trapped behind walls, starved, diseased, and destined for deportation to extermination camps, chose to fight rather than be led like cattle to their deaths. Armed with little more than pistols, homemade bombs, and sheer will, they stood against the might of the Nazi war machine, knowing their struggle could not be won, but determined that their humanity would not be erased in silence. The battle that followed was unequal and merciless. For weeks, the fighters resisted, ambushing soldiers in narrow alleys, setting fire to supply depots, and refusing to surrender even as the ghetto was systematically burned block by block. Families hid in bunkers beneath the rubble, listening as gunfire and explosions thundered above. The Nazis responded with overwhelming force, tanks, artillery, flamethrowers, turning the ghetto into an inferno. By the time the uprising was crushed, most of the fighters were dead, and the ghetto itself lay in ruins, its people either massacred on the spot or deported to Treblinka. What makes the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising so haunting is not only the bravery of those who resisted, but the hopelessness in which their courage was born. They knew they would not live, but they fought to prove that their lives, their culture, and their dignity mattered, even in the face of extermination. It is a dark lesson in both the cruelty of oppression and the unbreakable will of the human spirit, that even in the shadow of certain death, there can be resistance, and in resistance, a defiance that echoes louder than silence. The fall of Constantinople's atrocities, 1453. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not merely the end of an empire. It was a descent into chaos, where one of the world's greatest cities was drowned in blood and despair. For weeks, the Byzantine capital held out against the relentless Ottoman siege, its people clinging to hope behind the city's ancient walls. But when those walls finally crumbled, the Ottomans surged in with ferocity, unleashing a storm of violence upon a city that had once been the jewel of Christendom. What followed was 3 days of horror. Streets ran red as soldiers slaughtered anyone in their path. Men cut down in the open, priests butchered before their altars, and defenders hunted through the ruins. Women and children were dragged from their homes, enslaved, or subjected to unspeakable abuse, their cries echoing through the once sacred city. Libraries and churches, treasures of centuries, were looted and desecrated. their holy relics shattered, and their sanctuaries turned into slaughterhouses. Hagia Sophia, the grand cathedral, became a prison where thousands sought refuge, only to be taken as spoils of war. The atrocities of Constantinople's fall revealed the darkest side of conquest, where victory meant not only triumph over armies, but the annihilation of a people's spirit. It showed how power strips away humanity when a city is reduced to plunder, and how civilization itself can be torn apart in days by greed and vengeance. Constantinople's fall was more than the death of an empire. It was the agony of a people whose last cries were swallowed by fire, steel, and silence, leaving the world with a haunting reminder of how fragile even the mightiest walls can be against cruelty. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs was not simply the fall of an empire. It was the violent unraveling of a civilization, carried out with steel, gunpowder, and betrayal. In 1519, Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors marched into the Valley of Mexico, greeted at first with curiosity and diplomacy by the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. What followed was the slow suffocation of a people as alliances were forged with rival tribes, lies were spun, and disease arrived as an invisible weapon deadlier than any blade. Smallpox spread through the great city of Tenochtitlan, hollowing out its strength, killing thousands who had never seen the face of their enemy. The conquest was marked by brutality. Temples were desecrated, treasures plundered, and those who resisted were cut down without mercy. Women were taken as prizes, children enslaved, and the once magnificent city, home to advanced engineering, vibrant culture, and profound spirituality, was reduced to ash and rubble. The destruction was not only physical, but cultural, as sacred traditions were outlawed, gods declared false, and a proud people forced to kneel under the weight of conquest. The lesson of the Spanish conquest lies in the fragility of power when met with greed and deception. It shows how an empire built on centuries of knowledge and unity can be undone in mere years when betrayal, disease, and superior weaponry converge. The fall of the Aztecs was not the triumph of civilization over savagery, as conquerors claimed, but the silencing of a civilization that thrived long before Spain ever set sail. The ruins of Tenochtitlan still whisper of a world stolen, reminding us that conquest often cloaks genocide in the language of destiny. The Spanish conquest of the Incas. The Spanish conquest of the Incas was not the triumph of civilization over savagery. It was the deliberate destruction of one of the most advanced empires the world had ever seen. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors arrived in the Andes with fewer than 200 men, armed not with numbers but with steel, gunpowder, and a ruthless hunger for gold. The Incas, weakened by civil war and disease carried unknowingly by Europeans, were deceived by false promises of peace. At Cajamarca, Pizarro captured Emperor Atahualpa during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting, unleashing a storm of betrayal that shattered the heart of the empire. Atahualpa's ransom, the largest ever recorded, was paid in rooms filled floor to ceiling with gold and silver, yet he was executed anyway, strangled by his captors who never intended to keep their word. From there, the Spanish dismantled Inca society piece by piece. Sacred temples were stripped of treasures, cities razed, and countless people enslaved, forced to mine the very gold that fueled their own suffering. Whole communities collapsed under the brutality of forced labor and the crushing weight of foreign rule, while the knowledge, traditions, and achievements of the Inca civilization were erased or rewritten by their conquerors. The conquest of the Incas is a lesson in how greed cloaked in faith and empire can destroy even the mightiest of civilizations. It shows how betrayal and manipulation can achieve what armies alone cannot, and how entire peoples can be reduced to silence under the weight of conquest. The echoes of the Inca's fall still haunt the Andes, where ruins whisper of a world stolen in the name of glory and gold. The Armenian cultural destruction, post-genocide. The Armenian Genocide did not end with the death marches and massacres. It continued long after, in the deliberate erasure of memory, history, and identity. After 1915, when over 1 million Armenians were killed, what remained of their presence in the Ottoman Empire was systematically targeted for destruction. Churches that had stood for centuries were desecrated or torn down, ancient manuscripts were burned, cemeteries were bulldozed, and entire villages were renamed to strip them of their Armenian roots. It was not just a people that had been marked for extermination, but their culture, their story, their very existence in the land of their ancestors. This cultural annihilation was an attempt to finish what genocide had begun. Survivors scattered across the world carried their traditions in fragments, songs, recipes, prayers whispered in exile, while in their homeland, the silence grew heavier with each demolished church and every erased inscription. To destroy culture is to kill twice, once by taking lives, and again by erasing the proof that those lives ever existed. For Armenians, returning to the places of their forefathers meant walking through landscapes stripped of their memory, where sacred spaces had been turned into rubble and history itself had been rewritten to deny them belonging. The Armenian cultural destruction reveals a darker dimension of genocide. The war not just against bodies, but against memory. It teaches how erasure is as violent as killing, because it seeks to obliterate the soul of a people, leaving nothing for future generations to reclaim. The silence of those ruined churches and lost graves still cries out, reminding the world that destruction does not end with death. It lingers in the shadows where culture once thrived. The Marikana Massacre 2012. The Marikana Massacre of 2012 exposed the brutal cost of greed in a world that still pretends such horrors belong to the past. In South Africa, thousands of mine workers at the Lonmin Platinum Mine in Marikana went on strike, demanding a living wage and safer conditions. These were men who risked their lives every day in the dark, suffocating shafts of the earth, scraping precious metal that built fortunes for corporations while their own families lived in poverty. They carried sticks and machetes not as weapons of war, but as symbols of defiance, as desperate fathers and husbands pleading for dignity. The government's answer was bullets. On August 16th, police opened fire on the striking workers, unleashing a storm of gunfire that left 34 men dead and scores more wounded. Television cameras captured the moment men ran for their lives, cut down in the dust as their cries filled the air. Bodies lay sprawled on the ground, surrounded by armed officers who treated them not as citizens, but as threats to be eliminated. What makes Marikana so haunting is not only the massacre itself, but the betrayal it represented. In a nation that had once fought against apartheid's oppression, workers were now being killed by their own democratic government for daring to demand justice. Corporate profit was protected while human lives were discarded, and the echoes of colonial exploitation bled into modern-day South Africa. The Marikana Massacre stands as a reminder that oppression wears many faces, and that even in the 21st century, the lives of the poor can be traded for the comfort of the powerful. It is a wound carved into the conscience of a nation where the dust of the mines still whispers the names of those who died for dignity. The Syrian Civil War Atrocities. The Syrian Civil War was not only a conflict of politics and power, it was a descent into horror where civilians became the battlefield. Beginning in 2011 as peaceful protests for freedom and reform, the movement was met with bullets, arrests, and torture. What followed spiraled into one of the bloodiest conflicts of the modern era. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa became ruins of shattered stone and dust, their streets lined with corpses, their skies filled with the thunder of airstrikes. Families who once shared meals in safety were torn apart by barrel bombs, chemical weapons, and snipers who turned daily life into a death sentence. The atrocities were unrelenting. Hospitals were deliberately bombed, leaving children to die without care. Schools became graves, markets were transformed into blood-soaked chaos, and entire neighborhoods were starved under siege until desperation drove people to eat grass and leaves. Millions were displaced, forced to flee across deserts and seas, where many drowned, chasing the faintest hope of safety. Those who stayed endured prisons where torture chambers silenced dissent, where screams were swallowed by walls thick with blood. What makes the Syrian war so devastating is the complicity of silence. Global powers intervened not to save lives, but to stake claims, fueling the carnage with weapons and politics, while ordinary Syrians bore the cost. It is a lesson in how quickly humanity can vanish when power eclipses compassion, how easily the world can watch suffering unfold and do nothing. The war carved wounds into a nation that will echo for generations, reminding us that the deepest scars of conflict are not in cities destroyed, but in the lives broken and never rebuilt. The Sabra and Shatila Massacre, 1982. The Sabra and Shatila Massacre of 1982 was not war. It was slaughter carried out against the most vulnerable, while those with power stood by. In the chaos of Lebanon's civil war, after Israeli forces occupied West Beirut, armed militias from the Phalange, a Lebanese Christian group allied with Israel, entered the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. For 3 nights they moved through the narrow streets with knives, rifles, and hatred, killing indiscriminately. Men were dragged from their homes, women and girls were raped before being executed, and children were butchered without mercy. By the time it ended, thousands of unarmed civilians lay dead, their bodies rotting in alleys that once held life and laughter. The horror was magnified by complicity. The camps were surrounded by Israeli troops who fired flares into the night sky, illuminating the killing fields while claiming not to see. The world later recoiled in shock, but for the victims, there was no rescue, only silence, as their pleas were drowned in gunfire and blood. Families searching for their loved ones walked through streets piled with corpses, their grief mixing with the stench of death. The massacre was not a battle between armies. It was vengeance unleashed on innocents, carried out with a cruelty that erased the line between politics and atrocity. The lesson of Sabra and Shatila is one of abandonment, showing how civilians become pawns in the hands of those who claim to protect them, and how silence from the powerful can be as deadly as the weapons in the killer's hands. It is a reminder that massacres are not only committed by those who pull the trigger, but also by those who watch and do nothing. The Yalta Conference betrayals. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 was framed as a moment of unity, where the Allied leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, gathered to shape the world after victory in World War II. Yet beneath the handshakes and speeches lay a series of betrayals that condemned millions to decades of oppression. Decisions made in secret behind closed doors divided Europe like spoils of war, handing Eastern nations into the iron grip of the Soviet Union in exchange for promises of cooperation that would soon prove hollow. What was presented as peace was, in truth, the drawing of invisible chains across entire countries. For the people of Poland, the betrayal was devastating. They had fought bravely alongside the Allies, only to find their homeland delivered into Stalin's hands, their hopes for freedom traded for political convenience. The Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all were swallowed into a new empire of control, their futures decided without their consent. The rhetoric of liberation masked the reality of subjugation, as barbed wire and watchtowers replaced the Nazi occupation with a different tyranny. The betrayal at Yalta was not just territorial, it was moral. Leaders who spoke of freedom and democracy compromised those ideals to secure their own positions in a fragile post-war order. For millions, this meant silence, surveillance, and the crushing weight of authoritarian rule. The lesson of Yalta is a painful reminder of how power often cloaks itself in diplomacy, and how the voices of the vulnerable are easily sacrificed when great nations redraw maps. It shows how betrayal does not always come with guns and fire. Sometimes it comes with pens and promises, leaving generations to live with the consequences of decisions they never chose. The forgotten Korean War massacres. The Korean War is often remembered for its battles between North and South, but buried beneath the grand narratives are massacres that remain shrouded in silence, atrocities so vast they were deliberately erased from memory. Between 1950 and 1953, civilians became the battlefield's most vulnerable targets. Entire villages were annihilated, caught between armies that saw loyalty only in black and white. In South Korea, government forces carried out mass executions of suspected communists, lining up men, women, and even children before firing squads, their bodies dumped into unmarked pits. In the North, purges and retaliations were equally merciless, as anyone associated with the enemy was branded a traitor and slaughtered without trial. The No Gunri Massacre in 1950 stands as one of the most haunting. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, many of them children, sought safety under a bridge, only to be strafed by American planes and then gunned down by soldiers who feared infiltrators among them. Screams filled the tunnels, blood soaked the ground, and survivors were left with scars too deep for words. For decades, governments denied responsibility, burying evidence and silencing those who dared to speak. What makes these massacres especially tragic is the way they were erased from history. Families who lost generations were told to remain silent, their grief dismissed in the rush to shape a narrative of victory and heroism. The forgotten Korean War massacres are a chilling lesson in how war strips civilians of humanity, turning them into collateral damage in a struggle they never chose. Their silence echoes louder than the bombs, reminding us that the most devastating wounds of war are often the ones no one is allowed to remember. The War of 1812 burning of Washington. The burning of Washington during the War of 1812 was more than the destruction of buildings. It was a moment meant to humiliate a young nation and remind its people of their vulnerability. In August 1814, British forces marched into the American capital after defeating U.S. troops at the Battle of Bladensburg. With the city nearly undefended, soldiers set fire to the heart of American democracy. The Capitol, the Treasury, the Navy Yard, and the President's House, later known as the White House. Flames devoured the symbols of independence, and the night sky glowed with the burning of a nation's pride. For the people of Washington, the terror was immediate and personal. Families fled in panic, carrying only what they could hold, while the air filled with smoke and the heat of buildings collapsing. Important documents and treasures were hastily hidden or lost forever, while President James Madison and First Lady Dolly Madison narrowly escaped, saving the now legendary portrait of George Washington. What remained was a city in ruins, its heart reduced to smoldering ash, its government forced to scatter in disarray. The burning of Washington stands as a reminder of how fragile even the strongest ideals can seem under fire. It showed that independence won was not independence secured, and that pride can be humbled in a single night. For Americans, the sight of their capital in flames was seared into memory, a wound of humiliation, but also a spark of resilience. It was proof that nations are not invincible, and that symbols of power, no matter how grand, can vanish in smoke when the fires of war are unleashed. The Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902. The Philippine-American War was not a war of liberation. It was the crushing of a people's dream for freedom under the banner of empire. After helping the Filipinos fight against Spain in 1898, the United States presented itself as an ally, a beacon of democracy. But when Spain surrendered, the Philippines was sold like property in the Treaty of Paris, traded for $20 million, while the Filipinos who had shed blood for independence were denied their nationhood. What followed was betrayal turned to bloodshed. The U.S. military waged a brutal campaign against Filipino resistance fighters, branding them as insurgents rather than patriots. Villages were burned, civilians herded into concentration camps where disease and starvation spread, and countless innocents slaughtered in massacres that echoed with screams long buried by history. Soldiers spoke of killing everything over 10, a chilling phrase that revealed the dehumanization at the heart of the conflict. The war claimed hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives, many of them women and children who had no part in the fight. The Philippine-American War reveals the dark truth of imperial ambition cloaked in the language of progress. It shows how ideals of freedom can be twisted into tools of domination, how the liberator can become the oppressor when greed and power outweigh principle. The silence around this war in history books is itself a wound, erasing the suffering of a people who dared to believe they could govern themselves. The blood spilled between 1899 and 1902 stains not only the soil of the Philippines, but the conscience of a nation that preached liberty while practicing conquest. The Srebrenica Massacre, 1995. The Srebrenica Massacre was a wound carved into Europe at the close of the 20th century, a horrifying reminder that genocide was not confined to distant history. In July 1995, during the Bosnian War, the town of Srebrenica, declared a UN safe zone, became the site of betrayal and slaughter. Bosnian Muslims who had sought refuge under international protection were abandoned when Serbian forces surrounded the enclave. What followed was the cold, methodical execution of more than 8,000 men and boys, their bodies dumped into mass graves, their names reduced to numbers. The horror unfolded in silence as women were torn from their families, watching fathers, brothers, and sons led away never to return. Soldiers humiliated captives before killing them, forcing them to dig their own graves, shooting them in groups, and scattering their remains in hidden pits to mask the scale of the atrocity. Mothers searched for their children among lines of prisoners, their screams unanswered as buses carried their loved ones to death. The very peacekeepers entrusted with their protection stood by powerless, their blue helmets a symbol of promises broken. The darkness of Srebrenica lies not only in the massacre itself, but in the betrayal of trust. People who believed they were safe discovered too late that the world's assurances meant nothing. For survivors, the pain is not only loss, but abandonment, a reminder that justice can falter even under the gaze of the international community. The Srebrenica Massacre teaches how hatred, when left unchecked, can still erupt into genocide in modern times, and how silence, indifference, and cowardice can be accomplices to slaughter. It is a lesson etched in graves across Bosnia, that protection without action is nothing but an illusion. The Darfur Genocide, 2003. The Darfur Genocide is a wound that continues to bleed, a modern atrocity that shattered lives while the world looked away. Beginning in 2003, the Sudanese government and its allied Janjaweed militias unleashed terror upon the people of Darfur under the guise of quelling rebellion. Villages were burned to the ground, their flames lighting the night sky as homes, crops, and entire communities were reduced to ash. Men were executed in fields and marketplaces, women were subjected to systematic rape used as a weapon of war, and children were left orphaned, wandering among corpses in search of water and safety. The campaign was not only about killing bodies, but about erasing a people. Wells were poisoned, food supplies destroyed, and survivors driven into endless displacement, forced into camps where disease and starvation carried out what bullets and machetes did not. Over 300,000 people are believed to have died, with millions displaced, their lives suspended in a state of fear that has lasted decades. What makes Darfur so haunting is the betrayal of silence. The world knew images of burning villages and skeletal children reached the global stage, but action was slow, debates dragged on, and justice was smothered under politics. The perpetrators walked freely while survivors wasted away in camps, their pleas for recognition drowned by indifference. The Darfur Genocide reveals how ethnic hatred, once fueled by power, can consume entire populations, and how easily the promise of never again can be broken. It is a lesson in how apathy kills just as surely as bullets, and how the cries of the forgotten can echo for generations, unanswered and unavenged. The Chernobyl Disaster Cover-Up, 1986. The Chernobyl disaster was not only a nuclear catastrophe, it was a chilling lesson in how denial and secrecy can be deadlier than the accident itself. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded, releasing a massive cloud of radioactive poison into the sky. The blast turned night into fire, and the invisible enemy, radiation, spread silently across fields, rivers, and cities. Yet, as the air grew toxic, the truth was smothered. Authorities silenced warnings, insisting there was no danger, while families walked under radioactive rain. Children played in contaminated streets, and workers marched into the wreckage without protection, their bodies sacrificed to contain what should have been prevented. The cover-up was ruthless. Evacuations were delayed, doctors were forbidden to call radiation sickness by its name, and the full scale of contamination was hidden even from those tasked with cleaning it. Soldiers and firefighters, hailed later as liquidators, were sent into lethal zones with shovels and bare hands, many collapsing in agony within weeks, their suffering concealed behind walls of propaganda. The Soviet government withheld the truth not only from its own citizens, but from the world, allowing the invisible cloud to drift across Europe while millions breathed in silence, unaware of the danger. Chernobyl teaches a devastating truth. Lies can kill as effectively as fire. The disaster was not just the failure of a reactor, but the failure of a system that chose image over human life. The abandoned city of Pripyat, frozen in time, is a haunting monument to what happens when truth is buried. The echo of Chernobyl is not only the silence of its empty streets, but the silence of all those who died never knowing why. The Exxon Valdez oil spill cover-up, 1989. The Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989 was not just an environmental disaster, it was a betrayal of truth, buried beneath corporate power and silence. When the massive oil tanker ran aground off the coast of Alaska, over 11 million gallons of crude oil poured into Prince William Sound, blackening the waters, suffocating marine life, and coating once pristine shores in poison. Thousands of otters, seals, seabirds, and whales died in agony, their bodies washing up lifeless, their cries of survival drowned in waves of oil. Generations of indigenous communities who relied on the ocean's bounty saw their livelihoods destroyed, their ancestral waters turned into graveyards. But the deeper tragedy was not only the spill, it was the cover-up that followed. Exxon moved swiftly to downplay the scale of the catastrophe, releasing carefully crafted statements that minimized the devastation while deploying an army of lawyers to shield the corporation from accountability. Promises of swift cleanup and full restoration became hollow words as toxic residue lingered for decades, buried in sand and silt, where it continued to poison ecosystems long after the headlines faded. Workers hired to clean the oil were given little protection, many falling ill from exposure, their suffering dismissed as inconvenient truths. The Exxon Valdez disaster teaches us how greed can outlive guilt. It shows how corporations manipulate narrative to protect their image while silencing those who bear the heaviest cost. The oil that coated Alaska's waters may have thinned with time, but the scars remain in the fragile ecosystems never fully healed, in the communities betrayed, and in the truth buried beneath waves of denial. It is a lesson in how power can pollute not only nature, but memory itself. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, 1911. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911 was not just an industrial accident. It was a tragedy born of greed and disregard for human life. On March 25th, flames erupted in a garment factory in New York City where hundreds of young immigrant women worked long hours in suffocating conditions for meager pay. When the fire spread, panic swept through the building, but escape was impossible. The factory doors had been locked from the outside to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, trapping workers inside like prisoners. The scene was apocalyptic. Flames raced across floors filled with fabric scraps and wooden tables, choking the air with smoke. Dozens of women crowded stairwells and exits, only to find them sealed. Some fought desperately to climb the fire escape, which soon collapsed under the weight of bodies. With no way out, many workers leapt from windows, their dresses igniting as they fell, crashing onto the streets below, while horrified crowds watched helplessly. In less than half an hour, 146 people, mostly teenage girls and young women, were dead. What makes this tragedy so unbearable is how preventable it was. Greed had valued profit over lives, locking doors to control workers while ignoring basic safety. The fire revealed the human cost of exploitation, showing how corporations treated laborers as disposable tools rather than people. Families grieved daughters and sisters whose only crime was seeking a livelihood, and a city was left haunted by the image of burning bodies raining from the sky. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire stands as a brutal lesson that neglect and greed can turn workplaces into tombs, and that indifference to safety is as deadly as the flames themselves. The Rana Plaza Collapse, 2013. The Rana Plaza collapse in 2013 was not a natural disaster. It was a catastrophe carved out of greed, negligence, and the disposability of human lives. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, thousands of garment workers filed into the 8-story building to sew clothes destined for global brands, despite visible cracks in the walls that had appeared the day before. Their voices of fear were silenced by threats. Managers told them to keep working or lose their wages. Hours later, the building crumbled into dust and screams, burying over 100 people alive beneath concrete and steel, while more than 2,500 were maimed and scarred forever. The collapse was instantaneous, but the suffering stretched endlessly. Survivors clawed their way through rubble, trapped in darkness with the cries of dying co-workers echoing around them. Families waited outside for days, clinging to hope, only to watch bodies pulled out in plastic bags. The stench of death mixed with the sound of sewing machines that would never run again, a chilling reminder of the cost of cheap labor. The tragedy was not an accident. It was the direct result of a system that values profit over people. International fashion giants reaped fortunes while workers earned pennies, their safety ignored in the rush to meet impossible quotas. The collapse exposed the hidden cost of fast fashion, the lives of the poor crushed so that wealthier nations could dress cheaply. The Rana Plaza disaster is a stark lesson in how exploitation wears the mask of progress, how human beings can be reduced to tools in a machine of greed, and how warnings, when silenced, can turn into graves. The rubble of that building still cries out, not only for justice, but for the recognition of the lives spent so carelessly for the sake of consumption. The Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, 1905. Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg was not the suppression of a revolt. It was the murder of hope, the shattering of faith between people and their ruler. On January 22, 1905, thousands of workers, peasants, and families gathered peacefully to petition Tsar Nicholas II for better conditions, carrying icons and portraits as signs of loyalty. They marched with songs and prayers, not weapons, believing the Tsar would hear their cries for bread, justice, and dignity. Instead, as they approached the Winter Palace, soldiers opened fire. The snow was stained red as bullets tore through men, women, and children who had come only to beg for mercy. The massacre sent shockwaves through Russia. Parents watched children fall lifeless in the streets, priests carrying crosses were cut down, and families that had come together in faith left broken in pools of blood. The trust that ordinary people held in the Tsar collapsed in an instant, replaced with rage, despair, and the realization that their voices meant nothing. Hundreds lay dead, thousands wounded, yet their cries were dismissed, their suffering buried beneath official denials. Bloody Sunday marked a turning point, teaching the darkest lesson about power and betrayal. It revealed how quickly rulers will turn on their own when fear outweighs compassion, and how hope can be extinguished when those entrusted to protect instead become executioners. The massacre ignited a wave of strikes, protests, and rebellion, but its most lasting wound was the broken bond between ruler and people. The frozen streets of St. Petersburg still echo with the screams of that day, a reminder that when peaceful pleas are answered with bullets, faith is replaced by fire. The Ludlow Massacre, 1914. The Ludlow Massacre of 1914 was not a clash between equals. It was the brutal silencing of workers whose only weapon was their demand for dignity. In the coal fields of Colorado, miners and their families lived in squalor under the thumb of powerful corporations like Rockefeller's Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Striking for fair wages, safer conditions, and the right to unionize, they were forced from their company-owned homes and took shelter in tent colonies, clinging to hope amidst hunger and hardship. For months they endured harassment and violence from armed guards and state militia, but nothing could prepare them for the horror of April 20th. On that day, militia and company gunmen surrounded the Ludlow tent colony. Gunfire rained down for hours, tents were set ablaze, and chaos erupted as women and children scrambled for safety. When the smoke cleared, the bodies of 2 women and 11 children were found in a pit beneath one of the burned tents, suffocated and charred. Their deaths shocked the nation, yet those responsible claimed they were restoring order, twisting the massacre into justification for repression. The Ludlow Massacre reveals the darkness of unchecked corporate power, where profit was valued above human life and dissent was answered with bullets and fire. It exposes how those in power can turn soldiers against their own people, and how the struggle for justice is often met not with dialogue, but with slaughter. The cries of the miners' families still echo in history, a reminder of the price paid when workers dare to challenge the chains of exploitation and demand the simple right to live with dignity. The Bonus Army Massacre, 1932. The Bonus Army Massacre of 1932 was a betrayal that cut to the heart of America's promises, when those who had fought for their country were met not with gratitude, but with bayonets and fire. During the Great Depression, thousands of World War I veterans, unemployed, hungry, and desperate, marched to Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of the bonuses they had been promised for their service. They built makeshift camps and shanty towns near the Capitol, hoping their sacrifice would be honored. Instead, the government turned its army against them. On July 28th, troops commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, with tanks and cavalry at their side, descended upon the unarmed veterans and their families. Tear gas filled the air as soldiers drove them from their encampments. Tents and shelters were set ablaze, possessions destroyed, and lives scattered into chaos. At least 2 veterans were killed, hundreds were injured, and thousands were left homeless overnight. The very men who had once worn uniforms to defend their nation now found themselves beaten, and burned by the same flag they had fought beneath. The true darkness of the Bonus Army Massacre lies not just in the violence, but in the humiliation it inflicted. Veterans who had risked everything for their country realized that their suffering could be dismissed, their loyalty repaid with cruelty. The government's message was clear. Even heroes could be discarded when inconvenient. This event stands as a brutal lesson in the fragility of trust between citizens and their leaders, showing how quickly gratitude can turn to abandonment and how a nation can betray its defenders when compassion is replaced by fear and power. The Bhopal Disaster, 1984. The Bhopal disaster of 1984 remains one of the deadliest industrial tragedies in history, a night when an invisible poison stole the breath of thousands and left a city scarred forever. In the early hours of December 3rd, a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide leaked 40 tons of toxic methyl isocyanate gas into the air above Bhopal, India. As the poisonous cloud spread through the sleeping city, men, women, and children awoke choking, blinded, and gasping for air. Entire families collapsed in the streets as their lungs burned from within, their eyes seared by chemicals, their cries swallowed by the darkness. By morning, corpses lined the roads. Mothers clutched lifeless babies to their chests. Animals lay dead in piles, and hospitals overflowed with the dying. Conservative estimates put the immediate death toll at over 3,000, but in truth, tens of thousands more would perish in the years that followed from cancer, birth defects, and lingering respiratory diseases. Survivors carried twisted spines, failing organs, and broken futures, while children born long after the disaster still suffer from its genetic scars. What makes Bhopal so haunting is not only the scale of suffering, but the absence of justice. The corporation responsible downplayed the disaster. Executives escaped accountability, and victims were left with meager compensation that could never heal their wounds. The factory site itself remains contaminated, poisoning water supplies decades later, as if the city was abandoned to its fate. The Bhopal disaster is a lesson in the cost of negligence, how human lives can be sacrificed for corporate profit, and how indifference can weigh heavier than the gas itself. It is the echo of a night when the air itself became a weapon, and when silence and greed ensured the suffering would never truly end. The Guatemalan Civil War Atrocities, 1960 to 1996. The Guatemalan Civil War was not only a clash of armies, it was a decades-long nightmare in which the state turned its fury on its own people. For 36 years, Guatemala was consumed by a war between government forces and leftist guerrillas, but the true victims were civilians, especially the indigenous Maya population. Entire villages were branded as enemies of the state, and what followed was a campaign of terror so brutal that it would later be recognized as genocide. Soldiers swept through communities with fire and steel, massacring men, raping women, and slaughtering children in the name of counterinsurgency. The atrocities were relentless. Villages were burned to ash, crops destroyed, and survivors forced into displacement camps where hunger and disease finished what bullets and machetes had begun. In some cases, people were tortured in front of their families, made to disappear into secret prisons, or thrown into mass graves without names. Fear became a constant companion, silence a means of survival. By the time the war ended in 1996, over 200,000 people were dead or missing, the vast majority of them indigenous, their voices erased by the very government sworn to protect them. What makes this tragedy so haunting is how long the world looked away. Hidden in the jungles and mountains, the suffering of the Maya was ignored, their screams drowned beneath Cold War politics. The Guatemalan Civil War teaches the darkest lesson of all, that when ideology and power collide, the most vulnerable become expendable. The soil of Guatemala is layered with bones and silence, a graveyard of a people whose only crime was existing in the path of a state that saw their lives as obstacles to control. The Shah of Iran's secret police, Savak, abuses. The reign of the Shah of Iran was held together not by trust but by fear, engineered through the iron grip of his secret police, Savak. Created in the 1950s with the backing of the CIA and Mossad, Savak became one of the most feared intelligence agencies in the world. Its very name whispered like a curse. Its mission was clear: crush dissent, silence critics, and preserve the Shah's throne at any cost. To do this, it built a machinery of terror that reached into every corner of Iranian life. Savak's prisons became houses of nightmares. Students, intellectuals, clerics, and workers who dared to question the regime disappeared into cells where torture was routine. Electric shocks, beatings, mock executions, and psychological torment left bodies broken and minds shattered. Families lived in constant dread, never knowing if a knock on the door would mean their loved one had vanished forever. Informants filled neighborhoods, sowing paranoia so deep that friends stopped trusting friends, and even whispers at dinner tables felt dangerous. The horror lay not just in the brutality itself, but in the silence that followed. Western powers, eager to protect oil interests and a strategic ally, turned a blind eye to the suffering, speaking instead of Iran's modernization, while thousands were brutalized in darkness. The scars of Savak's reign did not fade with the fall of the Shah. They hardened into generational trauma, fueling rage that would explode in the revolution of 1979. The lesson of Savak is a warning etched in pain. When power clings to survival through fear and violence, it does not govern, it terrorizes. And when silence protects the oppressor, the echoes of suffering grow louder until they consume everything in their path. The Battle of Gallipoli, losses hidden, 1915 to 1916. The Battle of Gallipoli during World War I was hailed by some as a noble campaign, but behind the rhetoric lay a grim reality of staggering losses, concealed and downplayed to protect pride and political image. In 1915, Allied forces launched an assault on the Ottoman Empire, hoping to break through the Dardanelles and open a route to Russia. What unfolded instead was months of slaughter on unforgiving cliffs and beaches, where soldiers were sent again and again into hopeless assaults against well-fortified defenses. The truth was a nightmare. Young men from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand were mowed down by machine gun fire before they even reached the shore, their bodies littering the water's edge. Trenches filled with mud, disease, and decay became graves for thousands who never saw battle but wasted away from dysentery, thirst, or infection. The stench of death clung to the battlefield, and the cries of the wounded went unanswered as commanders clung to strategies that had already failed. Yet while soldiers endured unthinkable conditions, their suffering was buried beneath propaganda that painted the campaign as valorous, obscuring the scale of devastation. When the Allies finally retreated in 1916, more than 250,000 on each side were dead, wounded, or missing, an ocean of lives sacrificed in vain. But leaders concealed the enormity of the losses, transforming catastrophe into stories of honor and sacrifice. The hidden truth of Gallipoli teaches how governments can mask failure by cloaking tragedy in patriotism, leaving families to mourn silently while nations rewrite history. The beaches of Gallipoli remain soaked not just in blood, but in the betrayal of soldiers who died believing their suffering would matter. The Bengal Famine, 1943. The Bengal Famine of 1943 was a man-made catastrophe, a slow and deliberate starvation that claimed the lives of millions while the world turned its gaze elsewhere. In British-ruled India, crops had failed and war strained resources, yet it was not nature alone that carved hunger into the bones of Bengal. It was policy, greed, and neglect. Grain was exported and hoarded to feed the war effort. Prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary people, and relief was withheld by a colonial government that saw profit and power as more important than human survival. The streets of Calcutta became a graveyard. Families wandered in search of food, their children's stomachs bloated from starvation, their eyes glazed with a silence that spoke louder than words. Corpses lay in gutters, stripped of dignity, while vultures circled overhead. Mothers begged for rice as their infants withered in their arms, and fathers sold everything, tools, homes, even their wives and daughters, just to buy a handful of grain. 3 million lives were lost, not in battle, but in the cruel stillness of famine. What makes the Bengal famine so haunting is the indifference that allowed it to happen. Leaders dismissed the starving as expendable, their suffering buried beneath reports of efficiency and necessity. Winston Churchill himself infamously blamed Indians for their own deaths, sneering at the desperation of those whose cries for food went unanswered. The famine reveals the darkest truth. Starvation is not only a lack of food, but a lack of compassion. It is proof that neglect can kill more mercilessly than war, and that silence from those in power can turn hunger into a weapon. The soil of Bengal is heavy with the unmarked graves of millions, their voices lost, their suffering denied, a reminder that indifference is as deadly as any famine.